to share my screen when you get to my slides, or do you want to share and then I'll just narrate from your screen?
Hold up. Move that. All right, we're live. Sorry, what is your question, Drew?
Oh, I was just gonna ask whenever you get to my content, do you want to share my slides and I can just narrate, or do you want me to share my screen?
I already have the slides uploaded, so
All right, gotcha.
yeah. All right, so today we're going to be reviewing Alex O'Connor's debate with David Wood on high and low Christology. My name is Apollos. That's the name I go by online. I'm dedicated to bringing forth the most up-to-date Christian apologetics content out there on YouTube. And yeah, that's kind of what I do. So without further ado, the rest of you guys can go ahead and introduce yourselves. So we have people from Imago-Logos. So yeah, tell us about yourselves, guys.
Yeah, so I'll go first since I created the channel, I guess. Well, it's kind of a long story, but it started with Drew and Sam talking about wanting to create a YouTube channel or something like that for people who like are engaged in like the Sentinel apologetics community. And so I just decided to like have a channel ready for that. And then we decided to start uploading videos. Some of us are biblical studies majors. Some of us aren't. For me, I just kind of do it as a hobby. If you want like my contact info to like ask me any questions about this, because I'm the one who made the slides for this alongside Drew. Drew, can you like pull up the second slide, and then we can like show our links.
Yeah, give me a second.
Yeah.
I think Apollos has the slides. I've only got mine.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just go to the second one. Yeah. So if you want to find me, just go to Roy M on Instagram. I also have like a script written for this. That's like written thoughts. That's more formal. If you want that, I can give that to you. And obviously, check out the Imago-Logos channel.
I'm Sam. I'm part of Imago-Logos. I've released 2 videos so far. I'm not a biblical scholar or anything. I'm just interested in it. So that's all about me, I guess.
I'm Drew. I'm not a scholar, but I'm a biblical studies major at Carson Newman University. I'm just trying to, hopefully, training to be a scholar one day. Yeah, right now, just kind of do this stuff as both in school and kind of as a hobby. Yeah, Imago-Logos is just kind of a collective of people who are really, really interested in this stuff, and yeah, I'm just a part of them.
Is that all of us, or are we missing anyone?
I guess I'd go next, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go Cryptic.
All right. I'm Cryptic. I help Roy to voice the videos that he makes. I have an interest in Catholic theology and politics, and yeah, that's about it.
Yeah, it's not there on the slides because we forgot to add it, but his Twitter should be linked in the description if you want to like follow him.
Yeah.
But in terms of recent projects, we just released something on the titles in the Gospels, and we're gonna have some stuff on Christology soon enough. And I think Drew is working on a video, which is gonna be interesting.
Yeah, at some point I want to do something on Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9.
Yeah. We try to cover the more like unknown topics that should be talked about more, but aren't really.
Yeah,
which is
like
kind of like why
divine
we're
council
here.
theology and stuff like that.
Yeah, which is why we're here, because with this debate, although I liked a lot of the reviews, I feel like they just didn't do it justice, and they didn't go into some of the things that I wanted them to. And I think that we have some unique things to talk about, because like it's about this, right? Because we have some topics to cover that are going to be important to other debates that are happening right now, and you can see that, which is why we wanted to do this. So, for example, there's this idea of like Jesus being merely Yahweh in a lesser sense, but not like in the sense that like Nicene Christology would affirm. Like basically, some people are arguing for Arianism being the teaching of the New Testament, and we're going to go into why that doesn't work. And I think this debate is like a good way to help you understand that, if you will.
All right, so should we get to the debate, guys?
Yeah.
All right,
Let's
let's
get
do
started.
it. I think it's like somewhere here.
Christian ideas like the Trinity and the incarnation. That The primary way Jesus claimed to be God and that his followers claimed he's God gets overlooked by most Christians and non-Christians because we've lost touch with first century Jewish culture. We just tend to not notice things. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's a quote from Daniel Boyarin in his book, Jewish Gospels, the story of Jesus Christ, the story of the Jewish Christ.
Pause or whatever.
He says most, if not all, of the ideas and practices of the Jesus movement of the first century and the beginning of the second century, and even later, can be safely understood as part of the ideas and practices that we understand to be the Judaism of the period. The ideas of Trinity and incarnation, or certainly the germs of those ideas, were already present.
You said pause?
I said slow it down a little bit.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I do think that this is not a bad place to pause, though. Just it does demonstrate that, like, okay, if we want to understand, like, how the New Testament portrays Jesus as God, we can't just think of it in, like, modern day terms. We have to understand Jewish culture in that day, and hopefully that's something that we'll get into a lot. And David does get into it quite a bit in his opening statement with the two powers in heaven. But hopefully in the stream we'll get more into that theology of how there can be a figure who, you know, receives the name God, has the essence of God, but is still nonetheless distinct from God the Father.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm reminded of my debate I had against Carlos Xavier, like, and my whole point with that debate is that you can still have a very, very incredibly high Christology without, like, the full-blown Nicene Trinity with all the processions and all the details, like, ironed out over there. So,
granted,
yeah,
though, I do think that maybe this is controversial. I do think you can get very, very close to Nicene Christology all the way back in the Old Testament.
Gotcha.
And
yeah, I could definitely see that as conceivable for sure.
Well,
like, it's definitely one way of looking.
That's a video that we could make.
Yeah, we're gonna
sure.
get into this when it comes to the name theology and with the angel of the Lord, but I think you can get a Nicene Christology out of that.
Yeah. All right. Continue.
Yeah.
Among Jewish believers, well before Jesus came on the scene to incarnate in himself, as it were, those theological notions and take up his messianic calling. So the ideas were there, paving the way for Jesus who embodied them. Now, who's Daniel Boyarin to say that Christian ideas of the Trinity and the incarnation were already present in some form in first century Judaism? Is he a Christian apologist? No, he's a scholar of rabbinic Judaism. He's a Talmud scholar. He points out that a lot of the beliefs we now think of as distinctively Christian actually weren't. The earliest Christian church was embedded in first century Jewish culture, but as Christianity spread, it became dominated by Gentile Christians who tended to lose touch with the Jewish framework. And something was happening within Judaism as well. As Jewish orthodoxy was forming in the 2nd century, the rabbis tended to weed out certain ideas that had once been familiar in Judaism, but which had been adopted by Christians. The rabbis wanted to clearly distinguish Judaism from Christianity, and some of the ideas that were present in first century Judaism were soon deemed heretical. So Christians lost touch with the Jewish framework of early Christianity, and Jews abandoned some of the Jewish ideas that became part of Christianity. And the result is that today it's easy for us to miss a few things when we're reading the Bible. Things that would have been understood by listeners at the time might not be understood by us. Here in my opening statement, I'm going to briefly discuss the forgotten Jewish idea that's most relevant for understanding how Jesus claimed to be God, and then I'll show how this forgotten Jewish idea illuminates various passages in the New Testament. Some of you are familiar with the early Jewish belief in the two powers in heaven. Alan Siegel, a Jewish scholar, drew attention to this in his 1977 book, Two Powers in Heaven. And lots of people, especially Christians, have been interested in the topic ever since. Here's the idea in a nutshell. The Old Testament is very clear that there's one true God, but there are numerous passages in the Old Testament where we see two divine figures.
Yeah.
So one thing I want to say before we get into this, right, is that the explanation that people try to give to get around two powers theology essentially involves making the Old Testament into a polytheistic text. Because what they're saying is that the word Yahweh can have a referent that is a created being rather than a divine person. So David Wood is going to mention the angel of the Lord stuff, right? And one of the responses this is the response that, like, Jews usually give, right, is that this being is something that has the name Yahweh, but it's still a created angel, right? So this is important because really what you have is someone who's named Yahweh, who's created, and then you have someone else who's named Yahweh that is uncreated. But the issue is that Jews posit that these are like two different substances or like two different beings, right? So if you have two different beings, both of them are Yahweh, because obviously if you have the name Yahweh, then we can say that, oh, this person is Yahweh. It's like if someone has like the name Mark, we can say this person is Mark, right? So if you have two beings with the name Yahweh and they're not the same being, you have two Yahwehs, but that's polytheism. So whenever, like, for example, a rabbinic Jew is going to accuse Christianity of being polytheistic, you have to remember is that once they try to defend their own system and actually interpret these texts, they're basically going to fall into polytheism. And I think Alex is also going to fall into polytheism, or like making the Bible polytheistic when he interprets it. But we're going to get to that later.
Yeah, because if you take those, because David's going to bring up, say, Judges 6, where you have the angel of the Lord is being worshipped. I mean, if you admit that it's okay to worship the angel of the Lord, but you still say that's a different being than Yahweh, then you're saying it's okay to worship two different gods, which is not a monotheistic system.
Yeah.
So really, in order to, like, if you're going to still maintain the belief that the Hebrew Bible teaches monotheism, then you have to also admit that the angel of the Lord is Yahweh.
Yep. And actually, funny enough, I was reading a book about Leibniz. Now, if you don't know, Leibniz is like this important guy in logic.
Yeah, I'm familiar. Cosmological.
Yeah, so he's just a very important guy in like logic because of the developments he made. One funny thing he pointed out is he said that the Unitarians are actually just polytheists, because what they do is they're saying that there's this creature named Jesus who can be given worship, who's a separate substance than the Father. And his point against the Unitarians is it's not like what's it called? It's simply that they're polytheists, and he says that they have two gods.
Yeah,
we got a comment from Jacob Steeson saying Christology is just saying more magic. Except if you consider that Christology is an internal
how the Hebrew Bible or how the New Testament portrays Jesus.
Say that again.
You can be an atheist and study Christology. You can be an atheist and study how the New Testament portrays Jesus. So,
yeah,
I'm gonna
talking about.
Sure. Actually, I want to post the quote from Leibniz real quick. Hold on. You can keep on going. I'm just gonna post it in the chat, the YouTube chat.
All right, sounds good. I'll continue playing.
I'll give a few quick examples. There are tons of these. Sometimes God seems to be in two different places doing two different things. A common example is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord appears to Abraham and tells him that he's going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see firsthand how bad the people are. So he goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah, and what happens? Genesis 19:24. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. The Lord on earth rained down fire from the Lord out of heaven. This thing reboot every couple minutes. It sounds like there are two lords here. Watch what happens in Zechariah 2. Pay attention or you'll miss it. Come, Zion, escape, you who live in daughter Babylon. For this is what the Lord Almighty says. Who's speaking? The Lord Almighty. And he says, after the glorious one has sent me, the Lord was sent by the glorious one, against the nations that have plundered you, for whoever touches you touches the apple of his eye. I will surely raise my hand against them, so that their slaves will plunder them. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me. The Lord Almighty was sent by the Lord Almighty. Next paragraph. Shout and be glad, daughter Zion, for I am coming, and I will live among you, declares the Lord, Yahweh. Many nations will be joined with the Lord in that day and will become my people. I will live among you, and you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. The Lord, Yahweh, will live among them, and they will know that the Lord was sent by the Lord Almighty. So Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh. Yahweh is sent by Yahweh. Plenty of passages like these. Then we got a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. Whenever you think, whatever you think of when you think about angels, just get rid of that.
Oh, is it paused?
Yep.
So Drew might have more to say on this, but so if you pull up Amos 4:11, what's interesting is that it's recounting the same story in which fire is thrown at Sodom from heaven, right? And what it says is, I overthrew you as God threw over Sodom and Gomorrah. So what's interesting is that this is God speaking about how he's going to overthrow people, right? And what happens is that it switches from the singular, I mean, not the singular, it switches from first person to being in the third person, implying a distinct subject. So it's saying that there's two subjects there, or two persons, which is what we're saying.
Yeah, I'm looking at the verse right now. It's as I overthrew some of you, as when Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Yep. And then at the very end it says, declares the Lord, declares Yahweh. So you have Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, but Yahweh is the one speaking. So yeah, that's just another little tidbit that I noticed in there. Again, I think that's good evidence for like the early reception of the Sodom and Gomorrah tradition. The like people who were thinking about the Sodom and Gomorrah tradition when they saw like, okay, Yahweh rains down fire from Yahweh in heaven. It's like they understood that as a two powers in heaven situation.
Yep.
Quick thing before we go. I think you also kind of have a same thing in Jeremiah 50:40, where it says, "As when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighboring cities, declares the Lord." So there you have like the Lord declaring that God, overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So kind of like the same thing with Amos 4.
Yep.
Yeah, so in neither of these recountings of the Sodom and Gomorrah tradition, not in neither of these accountings of the event, you have God saying, "I overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." It's always Yahweh saying, "When Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." It doesn't seem to be when I did it. So there might be examples of that, but that's just interesting that in a lot of these recountings of the Sodom and Gomorrah tradition, Yahweh is speaking as if Elohim is another subject or another person, to use Trinitarian language.
All right, continue. All right, bad.
The angel of the Lord is no ordinary angel because this angel is somehow the Lord. Angel just means messenger. In Hebrew, it can refer to a human messenger, a spirit messenger, or in this case, the Lord himself. Look at Judges 6. The angel of the Lord came and sat down to talk to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon. Then it switches to the Lord turned to him. The Lord answered. Then it goes back to the angel of the Lord. Then when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. If you see the Lord in all his glory, you're dead. But if you see the angel of the Lord, who is somehow the Lord, you might survive." One more example of this. Here's Jacob blessing Joseph in Genesis 48. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys."
So just a quick comment on this verse, Genesis 48. If you do take like a critical documentary hypothesis stating or dividing of the Pentateuch, then this verse is a part of the J source, which is, according to most scholars, I think Van Cedars would contest this, but according to most scholars, the J source is the oldest source. So that means that you have this theology of both the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh being interchangeable. This is very, very old. It's not just a second temple development. This is very old in the Hebrew.
I would add, though, I don't hold the documentary hypothesis. I don't think most of us here do. But one thing I do want to point out is that if you can someone pull up the let me see. Someone pull up the slides and go to slide 3. Or no, wait. Yeah, slide 6. Slide 6. Go to slide 6. One more. One underneath, I think. Yeah. So what you can so the citation is right there, but Michael Heiser points out that, and he says this exactly in pages 71 to 2 in one of his books, that the explicit parallel of God and angel in Genesis 48, 15 to 16a, which is what David Wood referenced, therefore certainly does not imply that God is an angel. Rather, it affirms that this angel is God. The verb bless, moreover, is grammatically singular. A grammatically plural verb would indicate that he's talking to two different beings to bless the boys. So what's interesting is that, and he points out that the singular verb, right, it fuses them into one being. So it's saying that they're the same being.
Yeah, and also you have Hebrew parallelism as well, which Hebrew parallelism, if you don't know, it's basically a way of like doing a poetic structure in Hebrew poetry where they would essentially equate two ideas. I think Bart Ehrman has summarized it by saying, like, in Hebrew poetry they don't rhyme words, they rhyme ideas. So you have there'll be some more examples of this given tonight, but like you have Matthew comes in writing, or in Zechariah you have the Messiah coming in riding on a colt on a donkey. The colt and the donkey are equated as the same thing because they're in the parallelism. You have that going on here. So you have may God bless the boys, may God bless the boys, may the angel bless the boys. And the verb is all singular, so that's what's going on in your Hebrew parallelism. So they're equated not just to the singular verb, but also to the use of Hebrew parallelism, because Hebrew parallelism was a way of equating two subjects, two nouns.
So this isn't something that I have in the slideshow, but actually, Drew, how good are your Hebrew skills so far?
I don't trust them at all. So
okay,
well, I haven't taken Hebrew I haven't done a class in Hebrew yet. I've been
All right,
classing Greek, but
fair
not Hebrew.
enough. But there's actually a source I have. So I was reading Douglas Stewart's Exodus commentary, right? And in it, he points out that the phrase "angel of the Lord" might not be accurate, but instead the term in Hebrew might be accurately translated as the angel that is the Lord. And like what he points out is that the syntax and grammar of like the phrase "angel of the Lord" is similar to the syntax of like the river Euphrates, right? And what he points out is that just as like the river Euphrates is translated as the river that is the Euphrates, similarly Malach Yahweh, which is going to be like how you would say it in Hebrew, right? That can be translated as the messenger that is Yahweh. So that's also something that you can bring up to point out that the angel is clearly not just a created being, but rather is God.
Yeah, so these are just like big parts of like a cumulative case to
Yeah.
building up this whole idea of the second power in heaven, where Jews would have had this idea of a figure who is distinct from Yahweh, yet still bears, the name or the essence of Yahweh. And we'll talk later about
Yeah,
how
it's a different person, but it's the same being and the same essence.
Mhm.
Real quick, for those of you who watched the debate, does David Wood go into the Danielic Son of Man? Because I remember seeing. Okay, does he go into it like
He does
sooner or
in his
later?
opening
He
statement.
goes into it a little, and I have some stuff on that we should cover.
Yeah,
when he gets to
100%.
I haven't
Yeah.
studied the Daniel 7 thing as much as other people have here, I think, but I have Heiser's dissertation pulled up that I could probably.
Yeah, because I'm
I think,
familiar with the Theodosian Septuagent going into that.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I'm gonna
we'll
get
get
into
to that
that.
later.
I think you all
yeah.
have more to say there than I do. So
Yeah, I get into the Septuagint issue. Just wait until we get there.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. Remove.
Also,
Back on
on the
stage.
angel of the Lord stuff, I also wanted to point out when Abraham is like going to sacrifice his son, when the angel of the Lord comes to stop him, he says, "You have not withheld your son, your only son, from me."
Yep.
Not from God, from me.
That's important too, because I don't think like the authors of the Hebrew Bible, I don't think they would condone of people sacrificing to a created being. In fact, that's if you look at Isaiah's polemic behind like idolatry, right? The entire point is that these are created things. How can you sacrifice to created things? How can you give worship to created things, right? So, so if the angel of the Lord is having like Isaac sacrifice to him, quote unquote sacrifice, because that's not what really happens, but you get what I mean, right? But if that's happening to him, then the angel can't just be a creature, or else Isaiah's theology doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, it's more the occultic context.
Yeah, and also at the beginning of Exodus 3, it's the angel of Yahweh that's originally in the bush speaking to Abraham. So you have the angel of Yahweh is the one doing the "I am that I am." Yeah, we can move on. These are all just like a whole bunch of little tidbits and data pieces in the big cumulative case of building up this two powers idea.
We just have a lot
for
of
sure
on this. That's
so
why.
for those of you guys who are kind of lost, we're just trying to build a cumulative case for why something like high Christology doesn't violate monotheism, ancient Jewish monotheism, and is
also why it's
within that tradition.
Yeah, and also why it's anticipated in the Hebrew Bible too.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
But here we go.
He, singular. So the God, and the angel are all referring to the same being. The angel is God, but the angel is the messenger of God. This is all over the place in the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to the prophets. We just don't pay attention to it when we're reading. But there were ancient Jews who paid very close attention to passages like these, and they realized that something very, very strange is going on. There's one God, but there were two powers, two authorities in heaven. If you put all of the passages together, it seems like there's God you can't be around because his presence would destroy you, and God you can be around somehow. There's God you can't be around and God you can be around. The God you can't be around is distinct from the God you can be around. They interact with each other. One sends the other, and yet they're both God. This was all very, very confusing to first century Jews. If there's one God, why are there two powers in heaven? Why are there two powers who both act like God? They tried to deal with this problem in a number of ways, but mainly they were confused. And then Jesus came along. And he says, in effect, you know those two powers that you've been reading about in the scriptures? You know those two powers that you're so confused by? I can tell you about those two powers because I'm one of them. That's the primary way Jesus claims to be God. It's the primary way his followers claim that he's God. And it's the primary way, it's the primary issue that enrages his opponents. But did Jesus really claim to be one of the two powers in heaven? Since Jesus is a highly controversial figure, and since there's a skeptic in our midst, I would suggest that if we want to know what someone like Jesus is claiming about himself, we can look at 6 things. We can look at what Jesus says and what Jesus does, what he says and does as they relate to our topic. We can look at what his friends say and what his friends do. Here I mean what they say and do in reaction to him. And we can look at what his enemies say and what his enemies do, again, in reaction to him. So what Jesus says, what Jesus does, what his friends say, what his friends do, what his enemies say, what his enemies do. I would put all of that together and say that's our evidence that we need to account for, and that will give us the best indication of what Jesus was claiming about himself. We have a ton of time left, so we'll consider a few things Jesus says and does, and a few things his friends say and do. Along the way, we'll see the reactions of some of his enemies, and maybe I'll add a few more examples and rebuttals. What does Jesus say? Jesus claims to be one of the two powers in heaven in multiple ways. I'll give you 3. The most familiar is the Father-Son language he uses. Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Now, someone can be a son of God in various ways in the Bible. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. But Jesus claims to be the Son of God in a unique divine sense. For example, Matthew 11:27, all things have been handed over to me by my Father. And no one knows the Son except the Father. And no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. All things were handed over to the Son by the Father. No one knows the Son except the Father. Obviously, the people around Jesus knew him in some sense, but they didn't really know him. Only the Father really knows him. And no one knows the Father except the Son and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. No one can know the Father unless the Son chooses to reveal him. This should sound somewhat similar to the Old Testament idea that there's God you can't be around and God you can be around. Two powers, Father and Son. Jesus is the Son. Mark 12. While Jesus was teaching in the temple courts, he asked, why do the teachers of the law say that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself, speaking by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. David himself calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? Whose son is the Messiah? He's the son of David, but David calls the Messiah his Lord. How many lords do we have here? The Lord said to my Lord. According to Jesus, the second Lord here, the Lord of King David, is the Messiah. So we've got two powers in heaven, and Jesus is one of them. On a side note, if you're a Christian and you're wondering why we're talking about two powers instead of 3, where's the Holy Spirit? He's there, but we're focusing on how Jesus claimed to be God, and that's connected to two powers in heaven. Mark 14. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tore his garments and said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. What do the enemies say? This is blasphemy. What do? Tear their garments, that's what they do when they're outraged about blasphemy, and condemn him as deserving death. Why do they react like that? The Son of Man, that's Jesus' favorite title for himself, will be seated at the right hand of power. So there's the power, which sounds like God, and there's the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. How many powers in heaven? I see 2 here, and Jesus claims to be one of them.
Real quick, I think it deserves some repetition. I'm sure some other reviewers have covered this, but in ancient iconography, to be a throne sharer with a deity was to imply that you have the divine prerogatives of that deity himself as well. And so for Jesus to say that he's the Son of Man who's going to sit at the right hand of God, definitely points to the fact that he's like trying to grab whatever, I guess you could say, Old Testament quotes to show that he is of divine origin. He is of divine nature. And we'll get into a little bit about what I anticipate David Wood will say is the Danielic Son of Man. So does anyone else want to add anything else?
I have some stuff on the angel. Like I have like 2 page, like 4 pages worth on stuff on the angel of the Lord and what's it called, Daniel Son of Man. Should I wait till the end of his opening statement to cover that, or should we like let it? Like, should I say it all now?
Yeah, I'll just wait for him to mention it real quick.
You should wait.
Okay.
Let's not pour it all out right at the start.
Mm-hmm.
Drew, you should wait till Alex's statement is done, and then you can go over why it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, I might ask to pause it whenever he finishes his exegesis of John 10. And then I might go into my alternative interpretation as well as problems wrong with it. But and I think I do have a specific timestamp marked for whenever I want to bring up the name stuff. But we can get into that later, and I'll just bring it up whenever it feels the most appropriate.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something real quick. I remember Brant Petrie talking about this passage a lot. Now I don't know if Alex O'Connor, might say the blasphemy thing is Jesus claiming to be the Messiah or something, but. I remember him talking about how it was only really blasphemous to be a divine Messiah because, to claim to be the Messiah is, something you're expecting. And how else would you know he was going to come unless he's like, hey, I'm that guy. But specifically the fact that Jesus is saying, like, he's that pre-existent divine Messiah that's worshipped and all that, that gets him the blasphemy charge.
Yeah, for sure. We got a comment from Rembrandt saying Prophet of Zod did an expose on Woodhead. Don't know who Prophet of Zod is. He
Prophet
sounds
of,
familiar,
Like,
but
Prophet
he's
of
some
God
atheist
is
YouTuber.
he's
Didn't he
an
like quit
atheist
too?
YouTuber. Also, I do love your username, Rembrandt. Big Rembrandt fan.
yeah.
Yeah,
Alright,
Prophet of
let's-
Zod is he's an atheist YouTuber. Not as scholarly as people like Apologia. He doesn't interview scholars as much, but yeah, he's similar vein of content.
Mhm. All right, I'll continue.
Yeah, I don't really see how that's relevant because we're not David Wood,
Yeah.
and we're probably going to critique David Wood at some points because
I mean, if you want me to critique him
Who's
now,
Jesus claiming to be at his?
if you want
get
me to
into it.
critique him now, so I don't really like the language of two powers. I know it's like the language that scholars use, but it's not technically accurate to call it two powers. And also, I don't think he goes that well into the angel of the Lord stuff, but we're
Yeah,
gonna get
I
to that.
agree.
Or the Daniel stuff. He doesn't.
Yeah.
He should have covered more, but
It's such a
then
big
again, he has
topic
like
that you
time
can't really do.
constraints.
Yeah.
He has time constraints, so maybe it's
Yeah,
not his
because
fault.
you've got two steps. First, you've got to build up the two powers idea in the Old Testament, and then you've got to show how Jesus meets it in the New. You can't just. I mean, you've got two very big tasks that you're trying to
That's fair, yeah.
accomplish in a small debate. Okay, let's keep going.
Jewish trial. He's claiming to be the Son of Man, prophesied in Daniel 7:13-14. Daniel says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So there's the Ancient of Days, God, but there's also the Son of Man, who will be worshipped by all nations, whose dominion is everlasting, and who comes with the clouds. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is the one who rides the clouds. Humans don't, angels don't. Isaiah 19, see, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. Psalm 104, the Lord wraps himself in light as with a garment. He stretches out the heavens like a tent and lays the beams of his upper chambers on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. God comes with the clouds. So we've got the Ancient of Days, who sounds like God. And we've got the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, who sounds like God. Two powers in heaven, and Jesus claims to be one of them. Jesus claims to be one of the two powers in heaven multiple times, multiple ways, in multiple sources. Jesus says a lot more than that, but what does Jesus do?
So he's gonna be pivoting out of the Danielic Son of Man over here pretty soon. But Roy, what's special about the Septuagint version of Daniel 7?
Hold on. You might want to pull up the slides for this.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, go to slides 4 and you'll see. Yeah, so this is a pretty long quote from Charles Quarles, who's a New Testament scholar. He goes into the New Testament Greek. So basically, the reading up there is supported by like the earliest known manuscript of the Septuagint. And the issue is that some people argue that the reading is a scribal error, but the consensus now is that actually the whole thing that's happening in the Septuagint, or like the earliest manuscript, is it's a thought out interpretation of the Aramaic text, which equates the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days in terms of being. So you have this whole thing I was talking about with Genesis 48 and how you have two persons, one being. And what's interesting is that that's kind of happening in Daniel 7 with the Septuagint version. And in fact, the original Greek could probably go back to the Aramaic text. Similarly, like 2 Thessalonians and Revelation 1:1-14 conflates the descriptions as well of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days, which suggests that the reading of the manuscript that we have above is actually just known in the 1st century as well. And if that's the case, then the earliest interpretation of Daniel is the one that we're taking, where you have two persons, one being, which means that this is going to be the most antique interpretation there can be. Which means that any other interpretation that isn't Trinitarian is going to be a later interpretation, and it's probably going to be ad hoc too. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see why.
Yeah, so I actually just pulled up my Septuagint. I'm sharing my screen right now, and that is really interesting. So you have so the
Oh wait,
the English,
we can't see your screen.
okay, it's okay. I can just read the Septuagint.
Yeah.
So like the translation that I have, I'm using the Lexham English Septuagint. It says a being like the Son of Man came, and the Ancient of Days was present. But whenever I go to the Greek interlinear, it says the in between the words came and Ancient of Days, you have kai hos. So hos in Greek is a preposition that means as or like. So that's just really interesting. It's not translated in like the English translation of the Septuagint, but you do have that little
Yep.
that like
Yeah,
transition.
just
of phrase,
one
hos.
letter makes the whole difference.
Yeah.
So you're
and
saying
this is-
that- So you guys
Yeah.
are saying that the Septuagint is saying that the Son of Man didn't just come to the Ancient of Days, but he came as the Ancient of Days.
He is
basically completing
he's
their
the same in
identities.
terms of being. He's the same in terms of being is basically what it's positing.
Yeah.
It's going
Can
all
you
the
get
way
my
back-
I
can you
thought
get
the
my screen?
Septuagint was just a Greek translation, and that
So
It's interpretive sometimes.
yeah, it's
yeah.
interpretive.
I thought that
here,
the
actually, here,
Masoretic
here, it
text
might,
is always original, because
no.
that's
Here
what
it might
scholars
just
think.
preserve
No, that's the
original meaning.
KJV. That's the original
So
one.
here in this
Yeah.
case, it might preserve the original meaning, which is interesting. And
Yeah.
given that the other earliest texts and interpretations we have view it this way, do it that way, that tells us that it's correct. And another thing, Deuteronomy 33:26, I think Wood mentioned this. I'm not too sure, but it's not just that the cloud rider motif is like, because the context of it is that it's from the ancient Near East and it's always applied to deities. And as like a polemic, what happened is that the Israelites said, no, Baal is not the cloud rider, Yahweh is the cloud rider. And what they would do is they would appropriate that title to their god to like signify his supremacy, right?
Yeah.
So that alone makes it weird that the Son of Man is riding on the clouds of heaven, which he is in Daniel 7:13, because that alone would just make him Yahweh. Because the whole point of taking that title is to signify God's uniqueness, right? However, the fact is that Deuteronomy 33:26 explicitly says that only Yahweh rides on the clouds of heaven. So that combined with Mark 14:62 and Daniel 7:13 just basically proves our case on its own. But if you go to slide 5, you'll see something else, which Drew can probably confirm.
I'm still looking at the Greek Septuagint.
Okay.
I noticed that you had Apollos. You had my screen on there. Is it still on there? 'Cause I was gonna
No.
demonstrate this.
Okay, but so this is another quote from Charles Quarles, right? And what he points out is that the verb used to render service to the Son of Man is actually translated as worship. And when we see how it's used in Daniel, like contextually, it's used only to denote worship of God specifically. So
Yeah,
only God can be
Trevo.
worshipped this way. Yeah, so if you look at the citation he gives in Daniel 3:12, they refuse to worship the gods of the nations as like, because of the second commandment, right? So the fact that they're worshiping the Son of Man tells us that the Son of Man isn't a creature.
100%. So important lesson here, guys. Just because it's Hebrew doesn't mean it's the original manuscript. You can very well have Septuagint readings that go back to the original reading of the text.
Yeah. This isn't to
And
say
in
that
this
the
case,
Hebrew's
it's
wrong, though. Because the Hebrew, it's not like the Hebrew denies the reading. It's more so
Right.
that the Septuagint is going to like clarify it, if you get what I mean.
yeah, for sure.
It's the earliest interpretation.
Darthan says, "Look at all of this special pleading."
So true, Darth Than. So true.
Yeah,
It's over. We got to pack it up.
yeah. Gotta pack it up, boys. You guys are reaching pretty hard to make this a Trinity bit. Oh, I guess
I
giving
mean, if
evidence
you-
is reaching pretty hard.
Yeah, if you have,
No,
some
I was
argument
actually-
that
I was
shows that we're
responding to
wrong,
that.
I'd love to see it.
I was responding to that in the chat. This isn't okay. So at least our treatment of Daniel 7 is not so much saying, okay, this passage teaches the Trinity. Okay, what we're saying is that passages like these lay the groundwork for the Trinity in the New Testament. Okay, so in Daniel 7, what we're arguing is that you have this idea where you have the Ancient of Days and you have the Son of Man, and both of these figures are being treated as Yahweh. Okay, that's not the same as saying this passage teaches the Trinity, but it's saying that at least kind of teaches a part of it, or like a piece of it.
It teaches binitarianism at the very least.
Yeah,
Because you have
it
two
teaches
persons.
the idea that like two figures can be treated as Yahweh. And this
Nobody-
paves the way for later in the stream where we're going to demonstrate that Jesus is portrayed as one of these figures in the New Testament.
Nobody said that this verse alone is going to prove the Trinity, just that the non-Trinitarian interpretation is false. Because let's be real, there's no Binitarians out there, at least not that I know of. So the whole thing about, like, yeah, technically it's Binitarian, it doesn't explicitly teach the Trinity, but, like, typically in discourse, it's a dichotomy between Trinitarianism and Binitarianism. It would be, Trinitarianism and Unitarianism. It would be highly unlikely if Binitarianism was true. Like, that does not seem plausible.
Yeah. Well, there is Philo who does talk about the second power and not a third power. But I'm joking.
Yeah.
I'm joking.
If I had more time to prepare for this stream, I would have pulled some quotes from Philo because he's got a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
The whole
All right,
idea
let's
of the
continue.
Logos is one of the biggest thrusts of his philosophy. All right, let's continue. We've been yapping about Daniel 7 for a while.
Jesus judges the world. In the Old Testament, David says, "The Lord abides forever. He has established his throne for judgment, and he will judge the world in righteousness." Who's the judge here? Yahweh. But in Matthew 25, Jesus declares, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." Jesus goes on to say that he will admit certain people into heaven and cast others into hell. Why is Jesus the final judge? He tells us in John 5, "For the Father judges no one, but has given all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." You don't honor God, you can be around. You don't honor God, you can't be around. Jesus also raises the dead at the resurrection. According to the Old Testament, Yahweh is the one who raises the dead. For Samuel 2:6, "The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up." But Jesus says he's the one who raises the dead at the resurrection. John 5, "Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave to the Son also to have life in himself. He gave him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming, in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment." So Jesus claims by what he says and what he does that he's one of these two powers in heaven, and that means he's claiming to be God. And his friends got the message. How do his friends react? What do the early Christians say? In Philippians 2, Paul quotes an early Christian song or poem or creed about Jesus. It goes like this: "In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow."
This Philippians 2 song. So the fact that essentially prior to, so some scholars think that Paul is kind of composing a hymn kind of on the spot, while some scholars think that he's kind of more so pulling from an older hymn. I'm not really sure which camp I lean into, but either way, Paul quotes the hymn in the context of commanding the Philippians to be humble. So, and the hymn goes like, Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself. Okay, humility is, lowering yourself down, and that would not have the rhetorical effect if Jesus was not assumed to be equal
Actually
with God,
be
rightfully.
equal with God.
Yeah, because Jesus deserved, because the idea is that Jesus deserved.
Drew, can we get into that a bit later, though? Because
Okay, yeah, sorry, I just
we have
that.
O'Connor goes into that a bit, and I
Okay, does he? Okay, we can talk about that more than there.
Yeah, if you check the thing, you'll see.
Okay.
All right.
In heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, for the glory of God the Father. What's the name that is above every name? Yahweh. And in the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord. This is a reference to Isaiah 45. In verse 18, Yahweh says, "I am the Lord, and there is no other." And in verse 23, he says, "Before me every knee will bow, by me every tongue will swear." The early Christians said, that's Jesus. So Jesus was in very nature God. Then he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. Then God exalted him. How many powers do you see here? 2, and Jesus is one of them. Paul quotes that and obviously agrees with it, but look at how Paul describes the 2 powers. "For us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." There is one God, the Father. You see, Jesus can't be God. It's only one God. Well, keep reading. "And one Lord, Jesus Christ." Does that mean that Jesus is Lord, but the Father isn't? All Paul does here is take 2 titles for God and says, I'll call the Father God and Jesus Lord. 2 powers, and Jesus is one of them. What about John 1? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him.
So I don't know if David gets into this later, but that language of all things being through Christ that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 8. So that 1 Corinthians 8 passage is particularly interesting. Some scholars do think he's actually because he says it, I guess, more
Yeah, some
clearly
people
or
think it's a more
dogmatically.
subordinationist, like sort of like.
Well, no. What I was gonna say is that because Paul's quoting it almost dogmatically or very clearly, some people think he's referencing an earlier Christian confession and creed, kind of like the Corinthian Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. He's pulling from older material. And what's interesting about that is that it says that all things are from the Father, but then he says that all things are through Christ. So that this language about all things being through something is used of wisdom in Second Temple texts. So what comes to mind is like I think wisdom of Psalm 7. I have some more examples of this that we can get into later, but the idea is that all things were believed to be created through like the speech of God or the wisdom of God. Those things were created equated in like the Baruch 4, I think. But yeah, so wisdom would have been another example of this second power figure. That I kind of wish David got into more, but oh well. Did Apollos? Is he still there?
Yeah, I don't know about Apollos, but I know a lot of scholars have realized that Paul's like splitting up the Shema there, and to put
Are we still
Jesus
live? Should I check?
in the
No, we're still live. I got the stream here.
yeah, but to put Jesus in the Shema without him being like God, with how much Jews quoted that. Would basically, again, kind of go back to the Daniel 7 thing or the angel of the Lord, with it just being idolatry to put him in there if he wasn't, God.
Yeah. All right, let's see where Apollos went. Also, Rembrandt says in the chat, too bad there isn't any... Okay, he's getting back on. Okay, Rembrandt says, too bad there isn't any way to show that Paul's words have any relation to reality. That's not the goal of the stream tonight. The goal of the stream tonight is to say, okay, did Jesus claim to be God? And the fact that Paul's words, and also coupled by the fact that he's probably quoting something, that makes the idea of Jesus as the second power, that puts it very early in Christian history, which makes it much more likely that the historical Jesus claimed to be the second power, which in turn means that he claimed to be, have the same nature as Yahweh. So that the goal of the tonight's stream is not to do that. The goal of tonight's stream is to say, did Jesus claim to be God?
Yeah, plus Paul was correct in what he said because he was connected to the apostles themselves. And the apostles actually saw the risen Jesus and knew what he taught. And if you disbelieve what Christ said, even though he did miracles, then at that point, I'm not really sure what would convince you. Because you have someone who's raised from the dead, walked on water, fed 5,000, etc., through divine power. If that's not
Yeah.
good enough evidence, I don't know what is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
as
Well-
who was it? C.H. Dodd, who said it's very unlikely that Paul went all the way to Jerusalem to meet Peter and James just to talk about the weather. Like, no, they definitely talked about Jesus' teachings and
Yeah.
the reception of those teachings and how
Yeah.
those were passed down and implemented in the church. So, yeah, this idea that Paul just like invented Christianity is just quite. It bears the marks of French theory. So, yeah.
Okay, so Rembrandt now says, but we don't have any of Jesus' words. All we have are stories about him after he died.
Yeah, that's not true.
With the exception of extremely fringe theorists like Richard Carrier, pretty much every like liberal scholar would say that okay, at least some words of the historical Jesus are preserved in the canonical Gospels.
Yeah, for sure. And if you're like curious about like this from a more like epistemological perspective, evidence by definition is just merely information that raises the hypothesis, the probability of the hypothesis being true. So even if it happens to be like secondhand testimony, then it's still necessarily philosophically is admissible evidence. So
Okay, so last thing, and then we'll just move on.
yeah.
Rembrandt also claims that the Gospels have been written by people who apparently never met Jesus. We do have a video on our channel contesting that claim, arguing that the Gospels do stem from the apostles. So we can continue now. I just want to finish with that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll continue.
And without him was not anything made that was made. There's God, then there's the Word, but the Word was God. How many powers? 2, and Jesus is one of them. You really want a fun verse later in the same chapter, try John 1:18. No one has ever seen God. The only God who's at the Father's side, he has made him known.
Kicked out, I think.
What's that?
You gotta let Roy back in. He was in the. I think he might be in the waiting room. He got kicked out.
Oh, he was the anonymous author's theory, bro.
Am I up again? Yeah, so the whole
man.
thing about late dating is a massive cope. Suppose that they were written decades after, it doesn't matter because they're still by eyewitnesses. Regardless, they weren't written decades after. If you have some proof that they were, I'd love to see it.
Okay.
Also, Drew,
Drew,
check your DMs.
Okay, yeah, but let's focus mainly on just the stream instead of arguing with people in the chat.
Yeah, for sure. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm just going to stop responding to Rembrandt. He says that hearsay isn't evidence, and hearsay by definition is just an out-of-court statement. If you actually look at the federal statutes for what qualifies as evidence, secondhand statements can qualify as evidence. Say, for example, like the testimonies of expert testimonies of what happened in a certain laboratory experiment, or in some instances, reliable secondhand testimony. The whole point about hearsay not being admissible in a court setting, which it still can be admissible in a epistemological setting, is just to give like a fair hearing for those who want to testify for themselves firsthand. So this is just quite frankly, it's unfamiliar with, it's ignorant of the epistemology of testimony, eyewitness testimony, and yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
Okay, this really isn't the topic of the stream, though. I mean, if we want to debate this some other time, but
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
We got Theop. Apologetics.
He's free to come up if he wants to debate this. I'm sure we'd be fine with letting him in as long as he doesn't.
Yeah. Apollos, it might not be a bad idea since this is like a smaller stream. It might not be a bad idea just post a StreamYard in the chat, and we can just have people come in. As long as they don't like troll.
If they don't show anything, I'm fine with let them up here if they want to debate this.
For sure. Let me see if I can get the link.
Yeah, just wait. We'll see how they respond. If they say sure, then post the link. If they don't respond, then there's no point in posting the link.
Well, we can have other
he's a
people
man.
join too if they want to. I mean,
you guys know Theop, by the way?
I don't think I do.
Dude, he's like the Gen Z meme streamer for Christian content out there.
Tell him to get up here.
Definitely.
I always thought that was
Definitely
you. You're the guy like preserving filthy Frank humor in the 45.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, continue the video.
Yeah, he said he needs a few minutes. Rembrandt said it, so whatever.
Sounds like 2 powers. That's what the early Christians say, among other things. What do? Wrapping up, they worship him, they pray to him, they sing hymns to and about him, they baptize in his name, they compose litany and doxologies to honor and praise him. In other words, they give Jesus the full array of religious honors. What could convince a bunch of first-century Jews that a carpenter from Nazareth was one of the 2 powers in heaven? Probably the same thing that convinced his enemy that he was guilty of blasphemy. Would have to be something big, either really big claims of Jesus or a really big misunderstanding. We'll see which option Alex goes with.
All right.
All right. That is David Wood's opening statement. And
I would say I'm really disappointed that he didn't bring up Mark 14:62, where Jesus explicitly claims to be the Son of Man in Daniel 7.
Yeah, he just says, "I am, and you shall see the cloud. You shall see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," with the referent of Son of Man being himself. And if you just look through the gospel, you can see that.
Yeah, so that would have been a good thing for David to do, and I'm disappointed he didn't do that. But I think he still did a great job.
Pull up, what's it called? Pull up slide 6 of my presentation.
I'm really glad Dave did a more holistic approach to arguing this, kind of getting the Old Testament background for divine plurality.
Yeah, since we're all here, since the whole thing is done, you might want to just go through all the slides. Okay, we already went through that one. Oh, well, yeah. Okay, that's the one. So, what's interesting, right, is that, to be fair, I did criticize Wood for not going too much into it, but he had time constraints, so it's whatever. But one thing he didn't get into too much is the whole, visible versus invisible Yahweh thing, right? So, John 1:18 says that the Father has not been seen, right? And the only one who has seen him is the Son. And that's going to be important because that means that the person in the theophanies cannot be the Father, or the person represented cannot be the Father.
For sure.
And-
Rembrandt is
Oh yeah,
ready to
that's
join
a good,
if you
that's a
guys
good
want
point.
to.
Like, that's a
Sure.
good point. Like
If he just puts something on the screen, make sure to like disable his camera though, just in case.
Yeah, for sure. Mic settings. I think I'll just have to like kick him if he does present something weird.
Okay.
But yeah, here I'll add him.
Okay.
Rembrandt, the raider of Apollo's Christian Apologetics streams. How are you doing, my man?
hello.
I'm okay.
Nice.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I noticed that you've been giving a lot of comments regarding the reliability of the Gospels. And I'm
Wanna
more
talk
than
about
happy
that?
to entertain you if the rest of Imago-Logos is willing to.
Oh, I'd be happy
Because-
to. For now.
Yeah, for sure. Because it's your guys' stream, so I just want to be respectful of y'all's time. So
I will say that like we've only gotten just through David's opening statement. I think it'd be cool if we went through the whole debate. So I don't think we should spend too much time on this because
We can spend like 10 to
yeah, I
20
think
minutes-ish
I
on
think
this.
10-15 minutes is good.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so when you say the Gospels are anonymous or late, can you give up one piece of evidence to support that claim?
Well, Mark is generally considered to be the first gospel written, and it was dated at around 70.
Yeah, but what's the first of
By
all?
What's your
I don't
who?
accept
justification
Mark
for
in
that
priority.
Who
dating?
dated that?
Yeah, I don't accept Mark in priority. First of all, second of all, why should I accept that it's 78, even if I accepted Mark in priority?
Well, it discusses the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
other
what about
Jewish authors mentioned that.
Plus,
And they
that's just
clearly-
arguing in a circle. Like, if you're
Yeah.
arguing against the New Testament and its presentation of Jesus as a prophet, the only way to
Okay.
use the destruction of the temple is to argue that Jesus wasn't a prophet, therefore he can't tell the future. Therefore, whenever it says that he told the future, he was just wrong, and the gospel authors just made it up post 70 AD.
And not only that, but like just the idea of the temple being destroyed was a well-standing tradition, an internal critique within early Judaism. You have the prophet Jeremiah, you have early people who revolted against the Second Temple cult, various Second Temple factions within Judaism that saw that the end of the temple was nigh. So this idea that you need to be like, you need to posit like supernatural entities just to say that, Mark can only be after 70 is, quite frankly, it's stupid.
Oh yeah, plus the thing is that Mark doesn't even give us the details about the temple. So it gives us instructions on what people should do if the temple is destroyed in the winter, which implies that this saying is still relevant. Why would you say pray that the temple of destruction isn't in such and such season? That doesn't make any sense unless it's prior to 70 AD.
The temple was also viewed as like a microcosm of the cosmos. Josephus goes into this.
Yeah, I
because of
know,
that.
I know. They're not really talking about what he really says. They're talking
That's-
about the cosmos, and
That's not what I said.
you know, it's all figurative, and you know, and the
It's not what
entire
any of us said.
Bible.
Nobody has ever said it's figurative. I don't know why you're putting words in his mouth.
That's not what
Yeah.
I said. I said
Yeah, you're making stuff up right now.
I said that the cosmos.
No, you. No, I'm done with this thread. You people won't listen. You just will make believe.
You're the one who raised it on stream.
Yeah, like I say, you're just making stuff up, pulling it out of your butt, and you won't listen to anything I have to say. And you're
Okay.
sitting there laughing because I don't accept your make believe. Okay.
How is us making arguments against your claims making stuff up?
Yo,
Well,
Wait, wait.
how many of the gospel authors
wait, I have a question for
are
you. I have a question
listed
for you.
saying my name is so and so, and I wrote this.
All of them, because all of them have
No,
a title
they're-
at the start of the gospel.
None of
That's
them.
not the
None
question.
of them. None
That's
of
not
them.
true. It's all of them.
Put the
Rembrandt,
crack pipe down. Put the crack
Rembrandt.
pipe down.
real quick question: have you read Simon Gattercole's 2018 paper
No,
on
he has
the?
not.
No, I never heard of the man.
Yeah, absolutely has not.
Please
read.
actually read that paper.
No,
if you wanna
thank
talk.
you. It's all make believe. Look, blood magic isn't
Bro
real. You
appeals to
guys
scholarship
yo,
for
you
70
guys
CE,
can
but
special
then says
plead all
scholarship
you
is
want.
make-believe.
Blood magic isn't real. I'm
We're
done.
not talking about blood magic. We're talking about who wrote the Gospels. When we should be talking about did Jesus claim to be God in the New
All
Testament?
right, he
That's
left the
the debate
stream.
point.
He left the stream.
Oh, that was
Bro
hilarious.
thinks he's an elite troll.
Okay, I think that was a waste
Oh,
of time.
that was good. I'm definitely
No,
gonna
that was
clip
pretty
that.
funny. That was pretty funny.
Yeah. All right. Do we want to continue?
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
if we're
of
gonna
course.
get through the whole debate, but
No,
Yeah.
I can get through the whole debate as long as you're willing to stay.
I can
Yeah.
as well.
I'll try to.
So
Yeah.
Roy, do you want to finish your slides or just continue?
We were talking about what were we last talking about? Oh, we were talking about the whole theophany problem. So
Yeah.
Bo Branson brings this up, and I wish more people brought it up, but a big motivation for like Trinitarian theologies is going to be what Branson calls the theophany problem, and it's how like we see that in the Old Testament and the New Testament that says God cannot be seen, but then at the same time there's theophanies, and in fact sometimes these happen like right next to each other. I'm pretty sure. So how does that work? So what we're going to say is that works because you can have representations of the Son, but there's no theophany of the Father. But that requires two persons. So that requires Trinitarianism, basically, or at least Binitarianism. But Binitarianism leads into Trinitarianism anyways.
So
Yeah,
another
this is
thing-
why, like in 1 Corinthians 8, it doesn't say that the Father, through him, all things were made, but it says for him, all things were made. Because Jesus, the Son, the second power, assumes a demiurgical role within the whole creation making process. So, yeah.
Yeah, another thing that verse John 1:18 demonstrates is that John is aware of this whole idea of two powers in heaven. Like I'm sure John is aware of these Old Testament theophanies.
Yeah. We're going to get into that a little bit
Yeah.
later when Alex O'Connor brings up arguments against Jesus being the angel of the Lord. So we'll just wait till that.
Yeah.
All right, you want to continue then?
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, let's continue.
Although, wait, actually, isn't there a slide underneath that? Hold on, let me check. Yeah, there is. Okay,
This
so
one?
these are some quotes from Craig Keener's book, and I think it's Barber's book. And they
I've
go
got
into like
I've got his John commentary. If you want me to reference it at any points, I've got it right here.
yeah. So I actually do reference Keener's John commentary later on, but what's interesting is that I think David Wood brings this up with like the whole baptism thing, right? Is that the triadic formula only works under a Trinitarian understanding? Because, well, first of all, the word name in Matthew 28:19 is singular. Like the word name itself is singular, implying that there's one name shared by the three persons. Well, that name would just be Yahweh.
And also later in the stream, we're going to talk about how names and essences
Yep.
would have been viewed very similarly.
And another thing, right, is that there's actually a place in, I think Matthew, I think it's 10, where there's a plural usage of the word for names used for like a multiplicity of beings. But then when it comes to Matthew 28, it says that there's only one name, which is very important. And then on top of that, right, you just don't, like, think about it this way. You bless someone in the name of, I don't know, John the Baptist or Moses or whatever. No. Can you heal someone in their name? No. You can't do any of that. So why would you be able to baptize in the name of Christ if he's not God? Like the reason why you can't say, I bless you in the name of such and such is that person is going to be a creature. But the reason why you can baptize so like if baptism is greater than any of that, then how are you going to baptize in the name of Christ and the Holy Spirit alongside the Father if, they're not three divine persons?
All right. Continue on.
Yeah.
And Alex is going to take the podium for his 20-minute opening statement. David went over 1 minute and 14 seconds. So we'll give Alex a grace period of 1 minute and 14 seconds.
Can everybody hear me through here? Yes, David didn't factor in the clapping. I always factor in clapping into the timing of my speeches. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Or as we say in England, assalamu alaikum. I must apologize for the previous debate fiasco. David's right that most people don't know what happened. A lot of accusations thrown my way, but I suppose that is the essence of our debate this evening. People thinking they know a thing or two about a person without hearing it from their own mouth. To which effect, I was thinking about how to approach this, given that I didn't know which David was going to take. I woke up this morning in this fine resort, opposite Legoland, which means that there's a roller coaster just outside of my room. And being a bit jet lagged, I woke up quite late to the most peaceful of noises, that is the sound of children screaming for their lives. Hearing the sound of innocent children screaming for their lives, of course, reminded me to read the Old Testament. And I wanted to begin
Alex's opening.
You know,
with a verse.
I'll give Alex credit. He had a pretty funny opening.
That was too easy.
Yeah, I love Alex. He's awesome.
Yeah. Although I will say that
I've never
I don't
seen
wanna
this
get
side
into
of him,
this
to be
right now.
honest.
I don't want to get into this right now because that's a different topic. The whole thing
Yeah.
about like genocide in the Old Testament. I think everyone here is going to take the hyperbole view, right? I know I do. I know Drew does. What about
I
you
mean,
guys?
some form of it. I don't think it's just that,
Yeah.
but
So-
I mean,
A quick rundown is that it's ancient Near Eastern like warfare rhetoric
yeah, this is a
to
completely
like
different
talk
topic,
about
to be
how
honest.
you're going to destroy an entire nation and kill everyone in it, to just talk about winning in general. So when you hear statements such as like total destruction statements in the Old Testament, that's likely referring to like just victory in general rather than actual like genocide.
Yeah,
And there's good
this-
contextual reasons for taking this both like historically and in the text itself.
yeah, but
But
I don't
that's
think
for
we
a
need
different
to.
time.
Yeah, I don't. This is just a joke he made. I mean, I don't.
Yeah,
I would,
think
I
it
would
just should
probably
be
make
set
this
down.
joke too, because a lot of people do have that stereotype of the Old Testament anyway. So
Fair enough. All right, continue
Yeah.
on.
I factored that into my time as well. I want to begin with a verse from the Old Testament which might become relevant momentarily. And that is, well, a psalm, not in its entirety, but Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a curious psalm because it opens by saying that God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Elohim. That is definitely the word for gods. This seems to be an indication that God is talking about, the psalmist is talking about the so-called divine council, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the psalm, he says, I said, you are gods. You are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels, but I'm willing to just treat it as if it's historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually says about himself. The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David
before we
is
continue,
speaking
can I
about
pause for a second?
Oh, are we gonna talk about that comment?
So I want to wait till. So I want to. Well, I actually want to wait till Alex finishes exegesis of John 10 before I get into my stuff. But I will just say I actually do really like the approaches that both debaters took in this debate. It was very non-conventional. So like David definitely went way back into the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's the
while
thing I really
Alex
liked
did,
about David.
while Alex actually is presupposing the reliability of John, which I do like. I like how both debaters.
Yeah, I would just say that. I would just say that from what I've read, there seems to be a little bit of a turning point when it comes to like the reliability of John, where people are treating it as more reliable than they would before.
Yeah,
Obviously,
I agree,
it's
but
fully
that's
reliable. But that's a conversation for another day. I just
Yeah.
recommend seeing Lydia McGrew's book on the reliability of John. I think that's
Blomberg has a
fine.
book exclusively dedicated to John.
Yeah.
But okay, we can continue.
Same thing with Craig Blomberg and the whole like fourth quest for the historical Jesus and stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, another video for
All
another
right,
day.
yeah, continue. I just like how both debaters took an unconventional approach.
Yeah.
the two powers in heaven heresy, and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that people who believed in these two powers were talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except to someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God, that is, identical to Yahweh? Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be called gods, that is, sons of the Most High. So it's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says,
oh, are we going to pause? Okay,
So
it-
we kind of have like two sets of slides for this. So
yeah.
I think my slides are going to be a little bit simpler because you get more into the. How about this? Let's go through my slides since I didn't focus on this particular part that much. But yeah, okay. Go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. So let's like go through some things.
Yeah, I
First,
think it is good because I actually didn't go into the definition of Elohim at all in my slides, so I
Yeah.
think it'd be good if you did that before I did.
Elohim just means spiritual being. So when Psalm 82 mentions quote unquote multiple gods, that's going to be using the word Elohim, which is it's not like problematic theologically to say there's multiple spiritual beings. Second, I think he's just wrong about John being the most important book here. I think the Old Testament is probably more important. John is reliable, as I said before. Just look at McGrew and Petrie's book.
Yeah, another thing that I would like to add on the definition of Elohim. So, in his book Unseen Realm, Michael Heiser, he goes over the different beings that receive the term Elohim. He says Yahweh, the God of Israel, is called Elohim thousands of times. The members of Yahweh's council are called Elohim. So that's in Psalm 82, the psalm that Alex just quoted. Gods and goddesses of other nations receive the term Elohim. Demons receive the term Elohim in Deuteronomy 32:17. They're called the Shadim, which is a variant of that word. The deceased Samuel, so like the ghost or spirit of the deceased Samuel, is called an Elohim in 1 Samuel 28:13. And angels, or the angel of Yahweh, is receive the term Elohim, Deuteronomy 35:7.
Yeah, to give you like, I guess an example, right? An angel is an immaterial substance. God is an immaterial substance. Spirits are immaterial substances. Demons are immaterial substances. But it doesn't follow from that you have multiple gods. Like, just because God is an immaterial substance and there's only one God, it doesn't follow that you can derive a multiplicity of gods from there being a multiplicity of immaterial substances. So that's all Elohim means.
Yeah,
If you
so
want
the
to
word Elohim just means powerful spiritual being. All right, you can continue with your slides.
So, oh boy, we're gonna have to get into the exegesis of John 10. But first, I want to point out that Jesus is directly accused of being called God in Mark 14:62. That's the reason why the high priest gets mad. And I think that he like, just because he doesn't use the word theos there or Elohim doesn't matter, because I am is a more direct claim to be God, because theos or Elohim can be interpreted as just immaterial substance, whereas the I am or ego eimi, right? That can't be interpreted as anything else in that specific context. In different contexts, yeah, it's just a normal construction, but we'll get into this later when we talk about his interpretation of John 8. But there's a certain construction where you can't interpret it anywhere else, and so Mark 14:62 is probably gonna be one of those.
And for
Next
those
slide,
for those that don't know, Mark 14:62 is the passage where Jesus claims to be the Daniel 7 Son of Man figure, who we've already argued is portrayed as the second power in heaven, the second Yahweh.
Yeah. Okay. Go to the next slide and okay. So first we have to understand what like John 10 is talking about in the first place. Firstly, let's start with John 10:22, because that's where this whole episode starts. So verse 22 to 23 has Jesus entering. Verse 23 has Jesus getting posed a question. And then in verse 25 to 29, Jesus answers by basically giving like a list of certain operations where he says, the Father does this and likewise I do this, right? Or I do this and likewise the Father does this. And then immediately after, he declares, I am the Father are one, right? And that's going to be important because the context of this oneness claim, right? It's going to be operations, or in the Greek, energia, right? And this is what Bo Branson points out, is that this is actually how like the Cappadocians argued. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so this is how the Cappadocians argued. Really, what they argued is that because the Father and the Son do the same operations, therefore they have the same nature. And this is just the argument. So every operation done by the Father is done by Jesus. The Father does certain things that can only be done if something has the divine nature. Therefore, the Son does certain operations that can only be done if someone has the divine nature. Therefore, the Son has the divine nature. And we have it in formal logic on the right as well, if you want that. But that's how like the Cappadocians argue. And when you think about it, that is like a pretty reasonable way to argue. So, for example, right, and we'll get into this more when we talk about the eunomian premise, but the way we individuate kind natures is usually going to be with causal powers. So, for example, the way that you know that something is copper is like you would look at like how much electricity it could conduct, like how much it weighs, its density, and so forth, right? You look at its causal powers. So, if two things have the exact same causal powers or operations, it's going to be the case that they likely have the same nature, right? And this is especially the
Yeah.
case if the father has certain operations that can only be done if he has because of his nature, right? So, just one example, right? Saving or redeeming or creating. These are going to be things that are only possible if you have the divine nature, right? So, the fact that Jesus does each of these operations is going to be proof that he has a divine nature. Um, just as a quick question, how do you guys feel about canonic Christology?
What's that?
I know you
I
and I have
actually-
disagreed. You and I have disagreed with this one before, but I'm decently. I'm pretty.
Okay,
for
so here's the thing. One thing that the Father does is sustaining all existence. If you want like a proof of that, I would recommend looking at Thomas Aquinas's proof for like from actuality and potency, and from the distinction between essence and existence. And he goes into that why God must like uh, basically be the ground of all being concurrently, right? And so that's going to be something the Father does. And if Jesus does everything the Father does, it follows that the Son also sustains all existence, right? But that's going to be also during his earthly life, and I don't really see how that works with canonic Christology. But I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to leave that there for now. If you go to the next slide, we actually see that, for example, New Testament scholars such as Craig Keener are going to like show that, like the conclusion I made is kind of the conclusion that the author expects us to make, right? So the whole thing about like how God's people are the sheep of His hand, right? And how like Jesus is using that motif. That's a divine thing to do, right? And Jesus is applying that to Himself. And within that context, it becomes clear why He's doing that. It's a claim that He's God. So this is going to be the prior context of the whole Psalm 82 citation, right? And so if you go to the next slide, right, now we finally get into the place where O'Connor is going to be citing like his verses to make his claim that Jesus is denying to be God, right? That doesn't work because like as we've seen from the previous context, right, he's actually claiming to be God in like the first like 30 verses right there, right? So what happens is, in response to verse 30, the Jews pick up stones to try and get Jesus, right? Because he's claiming to be God. And then Jesus responds by saying that Psalm 82 calls other figures who aren't God by the term Elohim, right? And he says that if those figures then can be called God, then so can he, because he is greater, right? So Alex's interpretation is that Jesus is denying the charge of being God. But in reality, he is more so using like a legal technicality, and this is what Wood's interpretation is. So if you go to the next slide, so like he's really just using a legal technicality where he's saying like, okay, this person can be called Elohim or Theos. I'm greater than them, so I can also be called that, right? So he's not saying that he's actually one of the gods of Psalm 82. He's claiming to be greater, right? And I think Drew is going to get more into this, but if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
there's
I
nothing
show exactly
greater.
what Jesus is claiming to be, not
Yeah.
just that he's greater than the gods of the
Yeah.
council, but I show exactly what Jesus is saying when he quotes Psalm.
Yeah. So if you go to the next slide, we have a quote from Craig Keener on this as well. Yeah. So he calls us like a so much greater than reasoning, right? It's a how much more argument, and so that just supports my position more. So the issue is, right, how is Jesus greater? Well, the issue is that from what I know, is that the Jews wouldn't really have this understanding where like prior like they would have this understanding where it's the divine council and then right above that is God, right? If I'm not mistaken.
They would have the vice regent right next to God.
Yeah, so there's no vice regent in the sense that like the Canaanites had it, which because they're monotheists, right?
Yeah.
So the issue is that if Jesus and like Psalm 82, Drew's gonna get into this, but that's about the divine council rebelling. So if Jesus is so much greater than the divine council, and given the prior context, it seems that by claiming to be greater than, he's actually claiming to be God, right? So that seems to just support our interpretation more.
Or the vice regent who was the second power in heaven, which is
The
more
vice
clearly what we're
regent
claiming.
is
Yeah.
So, like, to explain to some people that don't get it, in the ancient Near Eastern thought, you had the high god, you had the vice regent, and then you had the divine council, and then you had humans, right? So the people in Psalm 82, that's going to be the divine council. Now the vice regent, they're in like ancient Near Eastern thought, typically the vice regent was like this subordinate deity, right? Who's like ontologically inferior.
Yeah, so
But-
El in the Ugaritic text, El was the head god, Baal was the vice regent.
Yep. But for the Israelites, they don't have a vice regent in that sense. Actually, Yahweh takes up both slots. He's both the head god and the vice regent, and they're both equal. So
Real
they're
quick, do you
different-
guys happen to know someone named Fresh Carrot?
Yes, I
Yes.
do. He's my friend.
All right, bet I'll add him.
Jack, you joined right before I started my slides.
Nice.
Yeah. So when it comes to like the vice regent thing, right? For them, Yahweh took both slots, and this Yahweh was different. So you have two persons, right? So let's just call it the Father who takes the head, right? The Son who's the vice regent, and they're both the same being, but they're different persons. And that's going to be important because if Jesus is claiming to be so much greater than the divine council, not just in the future when like he achieved, when like it's like in the future, right? What happens is theosis, right? In the future you have theosis, where but that's like after. That's well, and we're going to get into theosis a bit later on when Alex brings up John 17. But that's well
Right.
after the end times, right? So before that, you have the cosmology of angels, divine council, and then right above that is Yahweh. There's no in between. So if Jesus is currently speaking, like at the time that he told that to the Jews, if he's above the divine council, then he has to be in the slot of the vice regent or the
Yeah.
head god. But the vice regent and the head god are the same in Israelite theology, so he's just going to be God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that all you got?
Yeah, the next stuff I have is going to be on John 8:58, but I think you
Okay,
should cook on
yeah.
this next.
Yeah, so I compiled some slides this morning, essentially, on Alex O'Connor's just interpretation of John 10. Before we get into that, I think it'd be good to play the clip of him talking about it again, just so we can kind of get the idea more fresh in our minds. That'd be good for the audience.
You want me to go back a bit?
Yeah, go back like 2 minutes, maybe.
All right.
But does he correct them? He says,
Actually,
in response
go
to the
back
Jews,
to
is it
the
not
law.
written in your law, I have said you are so-called divine counsel, which also shows up in Job, for example. Later in the Psalm, he says, I said you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High. The psalmist is referring to beings here who are definitively not Yahweh, but calling them gods, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to make a point out of that. Jesus is going to do that for me as we turn to what I think is the most important Christological gospel of the four, which is, of course, John's gospel. Many people think that I just dismiss John's gospel because it's written too late or something. It is, of course, the least historically reliable of the gospels,
might
but I'm
want to
willing to
skip
just
ahead
treat
a
it as
little.
if it's
Yeah.
historically reliable for the purposes of this debate and see what Jesus actually said.
I think this is
What's that?
good. I think just keep going till he stops talking about John 10, and then I
Stop.
wanted to get his argument.
The question we're interested in here is the relationship that Jesus has to his Father. David has been speaking about the two powers in heaven heresy and saying that Jesus' relationship to the Father is the kind of relationship that people who believe in these two powers are talking about. Well, let's investigate that in Jesus' own words. There's one place in the Gospels where Jesus is directly accused of claiming to be God. Do you know where it is? It's in John chapter 10. In John chapter 10, his Jewish opponents come to him and say, if you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. And Jesus responds by saying, I and the Father are one. I'm told by Christians this is a direct Christological claim. Who can claim to be identical to the Father except for someone who is God? And there was no confusion about this. The Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him to death for making this claim. Now, how does Jesus respond? Does he agree with them? Or does he correct them? He says, in response to the Jews, is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods? Quoting, as you'll probably realize, the psalm that I just quoted and explained briefly a moment ago. So directly asked about his Christological status, Jesus decides to quote a psalm which is explicitly talking about beings who are not in fact Yahweh and yet are called gods. Why would he pick that psalm if the message he wanted to convey was that he is in fact in some sense God?
All right, that's probably good.
Yeah, pause it there. Drew, it's your turn.
Yeah, pause. Could you pull up my slides? Yeah, so while Apollos does that, I just want to kind of remind everyone that like Roy already talked about just like the Hebrew word Elohim and how it can refer to multiple or how the word Elohim just generally refers to a spiritual being. So before we kind of get into giving a better interpretation of Jesus' use of Psalm 82, I think it's important to go and get started with just some problems with Alex's interpretation. So from what I'm able to gather, it seems that Alex is claiming that Jesus is essentially placing himself as, or in the same kind of ontological category as the gods of Psalm 82. And this is a little problematic. For the first reason is that the escalated reaction of the Pharisees makes it seem as if Jesus is reinforcing and not correcting their assumptions of his claim to deity. So immediately after Jesus finishes his like exposition of Psalm 82, the Pharisees try to arrest him. So if Jesus was lessening his claim to divinity, this would not be expected. So Alex, later on in his opening statement, anticipates and counters this by saying that the Gospels oftentimes have a theme of the Pharisees misunderstanding Jesus. However, he has a burden of proof to fill this and doesn't demonstrate it. If you were to bring up passages like Mark 2, where the Pharisees think in their minds, oh, who can forgive sins but God alone, and then Jesus, in his interpretation, Matthew would correct that, that would be kind of presupposing a low Christology. So he would have to demonstrate this kind of theme of the Pharisees misunderstanding Jesus' claims of nearness to God. And additionally, Jesus placing himself in the same ontological category as the gods of Psalm 82 is incoherent, given his previous statement of I and the Father are one occurs like immediately before Jesus' quotation of Psalm 82. There's no evidence in Second Temple Jewish literature in the New Testament or any surrounding cultural context that people believe that Yahweh and the corrupt gods of Psalm 82 were viewed as one in any sense. All right, so we can continue. Next slide. Is it stuck? We got it. Here, I'll just share my screen. All right, can you all see my screen?
No, not yet.
All right, I think Apollos is going to have to pull it up.
By the way, after this, Sam, do you want to mention what you were talking about earlier with King of the Jews thing?
Sure.
We can get into that later, but essentially, just to kind of recap, like while Apollos is getting back, basically, Alex is interpreting, or from what I'm able to, I guess, assume Alex's interpretation is that Jesus is placing himself in the same ontological category as the gods of Psalm 82. However, that's unexpected, given that the Pharisees immediately react harshly. If Jesus was lessening his claims of divinity, which is what Alex thinks Jesus is doing, then we would not expect the Pharisees to react harshly. And additionally, we have no evidence of the gods of Psalm 82, the divine council members, being viewed as one with God in any sense, which Jesus claims earlier. So, all right, where did Apollos go?
That's a good question. You might want to try screen sharing again, since if he's
I'm screen sharing right now. I think he's got to approve it for it to be the main thing, though.
Sorry, boys.
There we go. All right.
Give me a second. Oh, okay, you're screen sharing.
All right, cool. Okay, so this is my screen?
Yep.
Yep, looks like it. Yeah, so I think in order to kind of really understand what Jesus is doing with Psalm 82 in John 10, we kind of need to get a closer look at Psalm 82 itself. So basically, before we get into Psalm 82 in particular, it's important to get kind of a backdrop of the theology of Psalm 82 and kind of what it's assuming. So ancient Israelites believed that the supreme God divided up the nations to his lesser sons. So like the sons of God in Job, they would have believed that each of these sons of God would have kind of been allotted their own particular nation. So these are the gods of Psalm 82. So a good example of this is Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. So another example of this would be Deuteronomy 4:19-20, where it talks about how Israel is not permitted to worship like the stars. Okay, stars would have been used as a common symbol for deities. So Israel is not permitted to worship other deities. But then immediately after that, God says other nations have been allotted to these deities. And then Daniel 10:20. So Daniel 10:20 talks about princes of different nations. So you have this idea that there would have been, some people would say angels, some people would say gods. The idea is that there's spiritual beings that are presiding over the different nations. That's the backdrop of Psalm 82. And in Psalm 82, God, who is called Elohim in the text, is prosecuting the gods. So it's a divine council scene. It's like a legal court scenario. And he's claiming that they rule the nations corruptly. So you see this in verses 2 through 5, where God kind of pronounces his judgment against, or not judgment, God pronounces his accusation against the gods of the nations of ruling corruptly. So what's interesting is that in verse 1, God is depicted as standing. So the verse in ESV says, God has taken his place in the divine council. The verb for taken his place oftentimes is translated in other versions as standing. So God is standing in the divine council. And that oftentimes was the posture of the prosecutor, the accuser in the council. So an example of this would be in Zechariah 3. You have the Satan, the accuser, is standing next to, I think it's Joshua who's being accused. And also in verses 2 to 5, he's the one who delivers the charge. So Psalm 82 portrays God, or portrays Yahweh as the prosecutor in the council, delivering a charge against the gods of the nations. So normally in divine council scenes, the prosecuting God was separate from the God who judges. So like an example of this is the divine council scene in Job. So you have God kind of presiding over the council, and then the Satan, the accuser, comes and accuses Job of not being faithful. Same thing happens in Zechariah 3. The Satan is a different figure. The Satan, the accuser, is a different figure from the one presiding over the council. However, in Psalm 82, God is both the prosecutor and the judge. So we see his role as the judge in verses 6 through 7, where Yahweh delivers the death sentence. So basically, I'll go ahead and read verses 6 through 7. These are the verses that Jesus quotes. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like a man you shall die and fall like any prince. So basically, God is delivering the death sentence against the corrupt gods of the nations. And additionally, in verse 8, he's called to rise. So it says, arise, O God, judge the earth. So the command for God to arise assumes that he's in a seated position, which would have been the posture of the judge of the council. So thus, in Psalm 82, Yahweh is portrayed as both the prosecutor and the judge. So in Psalm 82, the prosecutor and the judge of the council are one, so to speak. And we see this in Kirsten Nielsen's study on kind of court scenes in prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible. She concludes that it would appear, I'll just read the quote. It would appear from our brief survey of recent research, as well as from the textual analysis we have here performed, that it is characteristic of the prophetic lawsuit, so that's a similar genre of Psalm 82, that Yahweh enjoys the dual role of prosecutor and judge. So this isn't like some ad hoc way of reading Psalm 82. It's like, no, in scholarly literature, it's been recognized that Yahweh can play the role of both prosecutor and judge. And some people like Michael Heiser have said, okay, this might be what's going on in Psalm 82. And Heiser's not the only one. He quotes people in his dissertation and in his articles on this. So that's essentially the backdrop of Psalm 82 and kind of what Psalm 82.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
Wait, my bad for interrupting, but so I do want to talk about a different scholarly interpretation of this. And you're probably aware of this, but there's some that say that what's it called? Yahweh takes the place of the judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's some people who say that the person who takes the place as judge is distinct from the person who takes place like at the head of the council, right? You're aware of that interpretation,
yeah.
right?
So people like Mark Smith and Dan McClellan has also popularized this interpretation online, where you have two distinct gods in Psalm 82, Yahweh and El. That doesn't need to be the case, just because Yahweh oftentimes can play the role of both prosecutor and judge.
Yeah. But that's actually, see, the thing is, I don't think we have to argue against that. Let's just say that interpretation that Yahweh is distinct from the person at the head, right? That seems to go more with Trinitarianism than it does with
and we'll see why, later.
Yeah, because then we can just come in and say that Jesus is the judge and the one at the head is the Father. It doesn't like. Let me explain this. All that like let's say the alternative interpretation is correct, right? All they can prove is that there's two subjects, there's two persons. They can't prove two gods. Two gods is not a
Yeah.
valid conclusion from two persons. You need to have an additional premise in there, right?
Yeah, and you have
So
Benjamin Sommer's work basically arguing that it would have been pretty normal in the ancient Near East for, different, gods to act in different, bodies, or you could use the word bodies or
yeah,
persons or
yeah.
whatever.
So he thinks that deities can act through like different mediums, and we're
Yeah.
gonna say that God can be two persons, right?
Yeah.
Or three
Okay.
persons, but here it's only two persons, right?
Yeah, so that's basically, what Psalm 82 is doing. Psalm 82 casts Yahweh, the God of Israel, as both the prosecutor delivering a charge against the corrupt gods of the nations, but it also portrays him as the judge who issues the sentence and is seated in the court. All right, so now we're going to move on to essentially how Jesus uses this psalm. So the interpretive key to Jesus' quotation of Psalm 82 is the phrase, works of my Father. These works, according to verse 8, demonstrate that the Father is in Jesus. So let me just pull it up on Logos and I'll read it. Yeah, so verse 38 says, or verse 37 says, if I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. So basically, the works that Jesus is doing somehow demonstrate that he is essentially kind of one or in the Father. So how does Jesus doing the Father's works demonstrate this? What is the work of God in Psalm 82? Okay, so Jesus quotes Psalm 82, talks about the gods, but then talks about him doing the work of God, and somehow that demonstrates, his, in a sense, equality with God. So what is the work of God in Psalm 82? Well, in Psalm 82, 6 and 7, God pronounces a verdict of death against the corrupt gods. So that's what we talked about earlier. This is the work. The death sentence is the work. So the destruction of the corrupt gods and the reclaiming of their nations was anticipated by various Day of the Lord passages in the Old Testament. So like an example of this would be Isaiah 24, 66, and Zechariah 14. Isaiah 24 and Zechariah 14 in particular talk about like battles between God and the heavenly host of the other nations, whereas Isaiah 66, another Day of the Lord passage, talks about God kind of reclaiming the nations and building like an Israel of both Jew and Gentile. So yeah, and the coming of Jesus is a partial fulfillment of the Day of the Lord, and that can be demonstrated in Acts 2, where Peter quotes. I think it's Joel 3, which is the Day of the Lord passage, and so that it's being fulfilled. It was fulfilled through the coming of Christ. So early Christians understood the coming of Jesus as a partial fulfillment of this concept of the Day of the Lord, where the gods of the nations would be judged and the nations reclaimed. Yeah, and Jesus as the one who brings judgment against evil spiritual powers is stated explicitly in John's gospel. So John 12 says, now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler, archon in Greek, so archon it's very similar to Paul's language of principalities and powers in Ephesians. So now the ruler of this world will be cast out, and I will draw all people, so nations, to myself. So kind of compare that to Psalm 82, 6 through 8. So in Psalm 82, God delivers the judgment against the gods. He says, sons of the Most High, all of you, nevertheless, like men, you shall die. So he's proclaiming a death sentence against the gods. And then in verse 8, the psalm concludes by saying, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. So this is what's going on in John 12. Jesus casting out the ruler of the world. Now you might say, ruler of the world, oh, well, that's Satan. That's not the gods of Psalm 82. Well, there are Dead Sea Scroll readings that essentially have Belial. So Belial would have been like a prototype of Satan, kind of as the one who kind of leads these corrupt gods. So now the ruler of this world will be cast out. The corrupt spiritual powers will be cast out, and then will draw all people to myself. He will inherit the nations. That's the same template as in Psalm 82, where the judgment is proclaimed and the nations are inherited. Again, we see this in John 16:11 as well, concerning judgment, because the ruler of this world is judged. Yeah, so essentially what I'm arguing, and what other scholars have argued, mainly Heiser has argued, that John 10, 34 through 38 is basically another instance of this. In John 10, 34 through 38, Jesus defends his authority by claiming to be the one who delivers God's proclamation of judgment, the death sentence against the gods. Thus Jesus is the prosecutor who attacks the gods, while the Father is the judge. Both are Yahweh. Okay, we saw this in Psalm 82. To demonstrate the coherence of this reading, let's look at John 34 through 38 in full. So I'm just going to kind of read John 10, 34 through 38 and kind of give a commentary of it. If he called them gods to whom the word of God came, so logos tu theou, logos tu theou is essentially the proclamation of judgment in Psalm 82:7. You might hear word of God and think, oh, so that's the Torah, that's the law given at Sinai. Well, the Greek word for logos here, for word, logos is a very like broad word. It can mean like the Torah, but a lot of times it can also mean just a basic saying. It can mean a basic declaration. So just because you have logos theou, that doesn't mean it's the Torah. The word of God doesn't have to mean that. The word of God can also mean the proclamation of judgment delivered against the gods in Psalm 82. So if he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent out into the world? So consecrated and sent out into the world, according to this interpretation, is Jesus' mission to judge the rulers. Okay, that's what we saw here. Okay, part of Jesus' job is to cast out the ruler of the world, okay, the corrupt gods, and draw all people to himself. That's part of Jesus' mission in John's theology. Okay, so consecrated into the world, that's Jesus' mission. Do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming because I said I am the Son of God? So hopefully now it should be pretty clear. Jesus defends his authority by reminding the Pharisees of his mission. He is the prosecutor in Psalm 82 who chastises and judges and condemns the gods. Okay, so moving on with John. If I am not doing the works of my Father, so works of my Father, we've already kind of talked about that, is the verdict of execution that was decreed in Psalm 82 and anticipated in Day of Yahweh passages, where the gods would be defeated and the nations would be reclaimed. If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works. Okay, same thing. The works, the judging of the gods and reclaiming of the nations, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Jesus doing the work of bringing judgment demonstrates that the Father is in him, because in Psalm 82, the prosecutor and the judge were one. Okay, that's what we talked about in Psalm 82. The prosecutor and the judge were one, and Yahweh and Jesus is claiming to be the prosecutor. He's claiming to be, in a sense, the executioner of the gods. Now, there's an interesting book. I thought about mentioning this, whether or not I should, but there's an interesting book by a guy named Ryan Stokes. He's one of my professors, actually. He's taught classes at Yale Divinity School. That basically argues that in the divine council, the lines between like the prosecutor role and the executioner role would have been a little more blurred. It would have been a little more blurred. So the idea is that Jesus is the prosecutor and executor of the gods, and that would have been in Psalm 82. That would have been Yahweh. So yeah, that's about it. Is there anything else you guys want me to talk about or add?
That was very insightful.
Yeah, I think both of us are done with everything to do with John 10 for a bit. I don't think they're gonna go back into it that much. At least not as much depth. So we might have covered everything relating to John 10 that we could have. I'm trying to look up something. If you want to like continue it a little bit, you can.
I don't have any more slides after this, at least pertaining to John 10.
I think we should continue the debate then.
Yeah, let's continue. All right, I stopped sharing.
Yahweh. Jesus continues, if he called them gods, why wouldn't he call me God, the one who the Father has sent and set aside? So why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's son? Like in the divine council, you shall be all gods, that is, sons of the Most High. There's a misunderstanding. Jesus immediately afterwards clarifies further and says, believe the works, that is the works of my Father through me, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I am in the Father. Another
I would like to pause for a second.
Claim. What does it mean?
I think Alex needs to show how his interpretation of Jesus' use of Psalm 82 can lead to the misconception or the idea that Jesus is equal to God.
Let's turn to the most important Christological chapter in John's Gospel, which is, of course, chapter 17. Jesus is praying, first for his disciples, then for all of his believers. Remember, in John chapter 10 so far, Jesus has made two claims. I and the Father are one, and I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, addressing the relationship that he has to his Father, which David thinks is the two powers in heaven. What does Jesus say in his own words? John chapter 17, verse 20 onwards. My prayer is not for them alone, the disciples. I pray also for those who believe in me through their message, that is, all of you, that all of them may be one. Hen, H-E-N, the same Greek word used in John 10. Father, just as you are in me, and I am in you, may they also be in us. This is crucial, this is pivotal. When Jesus is asked to clarify his Christological status, what is his relationship to the Father? He says, I'm in the Father and the Father's in me. He then later prays that all of us will one day be in God in the same way, just as, kathos in the Greek, which doesn't just mean as, it means in the same way as, just as. If this is supposed to indicate that Jesus is claiming to be identical to Yahweh, what does that make the rest of us? And how, I'm interested in knowing, is David going to interpret these verses where Jesus is specifically asked to clarify his relationship to the Father and tells us that he is only in relationship with him in such a way that everybody else can be in relationship with them too. The same thing is true of another important quote from John's Gospel, which is when Philip asks Jesus to show him the Father. What does Jesus say? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Another intense Christological claim. He then follows up by saying, how can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. So again, Jesus clarifies his relationship to the Father, this time saying that he doesn't speak on his own authority. But there's more. In the same chapter this time, chapter 14, just a few verses later, he says to those same disciples who he's just told, that if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because the Father is in me, and I'm in the Father. He speaks of a future day, past his crucifixion, and says, on that day, verse 20, on that day you will realize that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you. So to recap, Jesus is directly asked to clarify his relationship in his Christology to the Father. And he says that I'm in the Father, and the Father's in me, and guess what? You'll all be one with us too.
Do you want to pause
This
here?
claim
Because
to
I do
Yahweh
have some
that-
stuff on John 17.
Yeah, you told me that you had some stuff on the
Yeah, let me see
on
where
like the
it is.
believers being one as well.
Mhm.
I'm gonna get some water. I'll be right back. My throat is sore from talking.
Go to slide like 24, which I know that's kind of far down, but you know. Oh, Paul, is he there? Okay.
I am back.
Oh, okay.
Oh, where'd he go?
Apollos, what happened? Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but basically, so in John 17, right, the whole point is that Jesus has glory, right,
Mm-hmm.
and that he's also going to give glory to the disciples, correct? So the issue is that like we can now I wanted to talk about this earlier, right? But I wanted to save it here, right? Drew, you want to talk about theosis for a bit, since you were wanting to get into that a bit.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say one thing that just came to mind. So Alex is claiming that, like, you know, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one," but later on in John 17, Jesus also prays that he and the disciples would be one. So I guess Alex's claim is that, like, the same unity between the Father and Jesus is the exact same unity between the disciples and Jesus. Whereas that necessarily can't be the case, at least in John 17, because in John 17, I don't have the text pulled up right now, but it's either in verses 1 through 3, where actually I'll pull it up on my computer. Yeah, so verse 5 actually says, Jesus prays to God, and now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. Okay, Jesus had glory. Jesus had a relationship with the Father before the world existed. Okay, so that means that Jesus' relationship with the Father, in some sense, supersedes the relationship that Jesus has with the disciples. Yeah, and part of Alex does hit a very important nuance that part of salvation in John's gospel is the idea of kind of being grafted into or brought into that relationship between Christ and the Father through the Holy Spirit. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the exact same relationship, so to speak. And it can't be the same relationship just because you have Jesus talking about how he had a relationship with the Father before the world began.
Yep. So it can't be the literal same glory, right?
Yeah. Otherwise, John thinks that that Christians are uncreated beings, which probably isn't the case.
Yep. Around slide 24.
Yeah.
Oh wait, hold on. Let me see this. Yeah. Okay, so he kind of like talks about how the disciples are transferred the glory of Christ. The issue is, right, it says that God has performed the act of giving them glory, right? Now, there's an interesting passage, right, where Drew might remember this. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but it's in one of the letters, right, where it talks about how God has given people glory from eternity past, right? Do you remember where it is?
Could you be more specific?
There's this one verse that like people use in response to John 17:5, where it says that God gives people glory from eternity past, like predestines that glory, basically.
Yeah, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they existed back then.
Are you
So
are you thinking of stuff in like Romans 8, like predestined to his son or something?
No, I know what he's talking about. I'm trying to find it.
yeah, it's in one of the epistles. Might be in Second Peter. Nope. But basically, right, once we find it, the whole point is that God gives glory to people from eternity past, right? But when they actually receive that glory is going to be different. So to explain it this way, right? God is going to predestine someone to salvation or like call them to salvation from like eternity past, right? But
Mm-hmm.
they're only going to be like fully saved later on. So there's a gap between when, God decrees something and when that thing happens, right? And
Yeah.
so similarly, right, Jesus says that he's already decreed the disciples to have glory. But the issue is that clearly this glory is going to be in the future, because if they're having the same glory, right, then I think Drew is going to agree with me on this, is that they're talking about theosis. It's talking about how the disciples are going to have the same glory as like as like the son has, right, in his humanity. And that's going to be through theosis. But that only is completed at the end times, right? Like well after the grand narrative of history is over and after everything has ended. That's when theosis is complete, right?
Yeah.
So John 17 is saying that the disciples will in the future have theosis, right? Now, the issue is that according to John 17:5, it's not just that Jesus was given glory at the like before, it's that Jesus actually had that glory itself prior to the creation of the world.
Yeah,
Which means that
and so
Jesus has
I'm looking at John 17 now. This isn't just in verse 5, it's also in verse 24.
Yep.
Father, I desire that Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you love me before the foundation of the world.
Yep. So this is important because according to John 17:5, Jesus already has that glory, and that glory is given to the disciples in the future, and that's going to be via theosis, right?
Yeah. So Alex is basically claiming that like the relationship between Jesus and the Father is the same as the relationship between Jesus and the disciples. If that's true, if that is John's theology, then John must also believe, based on these statements in John 17:5 and John 17:25, or not in 24, that if that's the case, then based on these statements, John must also believe that the disciples existed eternally, which is
Yeah.
unlikely.
So another thing, right, is that according to Isaiah, God doesn't share his glory, right? And Alex is going to get into that, and he's going to like avoid it by saying, "Well, yeah, John 17 says otherwise," right? The issue is that Isaiah is talking about the here and now, right? Whereas John 17 is talking about in the future after everything is complete, right?
Yeah, it's eschatological.
Yeah. So Isaiah is talking about how in the current nobody has the glory that God has, right? Nobody is sinless like God is currently, right? But that doesn't mean in the future we're not going to be sinless, right? So that's important because Jesus is alive according to John at the same time when Isaiah is proclaiming that God hasn't shared his glory to anyone, right? And since
Yeah.
Jesus is around and he has that glory, that means he must be God. Because according to Isaiah, the glory is unique to God alone. So if Jesus has that glory at the time when Isaiah is speaking, right, then it follows that Jesus is God. Now, the only way Alex is going to try to avoid this is by saying, yeah, but the disciples have that glory too, which isn't really a rebuttal to the argument. It's more like, I guess you could say a counter example. It's just the issue is that it's a different point in time. Like, this is glory, after the recreation, after theosis, after like revelation is complete, right? Whereas the glory Jesus has is already in the here and now. And
Yeah.
I think Bo Branson talks about this, right? It's where like the big issue for Unitarianism is like you kind of have this thing where you have the Father, and then the Father like communicates the divine energies to the Son, and the Son is a creature, but then the Son just communicates those energies to us. But like at that point, what's the point of the mediator, right? Like if God is just going to communicate those energies to this creature, what's the point of that, right?
Yeah.
And we can put that out about like Alex's interpretation too, right? Like, what is the point? Like, let's say under his view, where Jesus is just like a creature, and then the Father is communicating like the divine energies to him, right? Or like the divine glory, right? Like, well, what's the point of the mediator there? I'm not really too sure, because like with the Trinitarians, we have a reason for the mediator, and that's like with the divine love and how relations work and so forth, right? But I don't see this interpretation where there's just a created mediator who communicates energies. I don't see how that works. Like, just philosophically, right? That doesn't make sense to me. And if John is trying to say that Jesus is a created mediator who communicates glory, right? I don't think that would make the gospel coherent, or it wouldn't make it make sense, right? Whereas if Jesus is a uncreated mediator who has glory, eternity past, and therefore is God, and then he comes into the world, and it is through that incarnation that we're able to be saved, and thus we're able to complete theosis, and then we're able to have the divine energies, right? So that interpretation makes more sense to me, and it seems to be more of a logical explanation of what's going on in John 17 than Alex's interpretation.
Yeah. All right. Are we ready to move on?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
What's
was
the
gonna
question?
say, regarding the saying how why would there be a mediator? Could you say that since there were other prophets, or at least other times in which God used people, such as Moses on the mountain,
Uh-huh.
to bring down to use him as a mediator to give the message, or a message of a kind at least.
But that's a message, not like theosis and
Okay.
salvation itself.
Uh-huh.
Because when we talk about theosis, we're talking about
I'm not too familiar with that term, by the
it's
way.
it's like the glory.
So
Do you know the
so
quote? Do you know the quote from Saint Athanasius about God became man so man could become God-like?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so the whole idea is so Eastern Orthodoxy is going to say that this is via the divine energies. I don't really know what people's positions are here,
it's not
but
just an Eastern Orthodox thing. Heiser's brought it to evangelicalism.
yeah. So the idea is you have the divine glory or the divine energies, and that's communicated to human persons, right? Whereas in the Catholic tradition, you have created grace, and that's going to be your glory. I don't really feel like getting into the debate right now. I don't care. That has nothing to do with this.
So theosis is just participating in the
It's
person or
participation in
essence
the
of
divine.
God. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's conformity not just to the behavior of God necessarily, but also conformity to
No, it's conformity to how God acts, because
that's part of it, but more deeper, it's
yeah.
conformity to the essence of God, I guess.
Okay.
I don't think anyone thinks that the essence of God is what you become, but rather
It's like a mathematical asymptote. You never reach the point of becoming.
Sure. Well, we'll leave it there.
I think this is kind of a red herring.
Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking if it does compare more so to the behavior, I think you could say that with the Ten Commandments, that could be a push towards behavior. If it's more so the essence,
because you don't achieve you don't follow the 10 Commandments in Moses, right? You don't say Moses has saved me, and because of what Moses has did, I can now follow the 10 Commandments. That's still yeah. So the issue is, right, so what we're saying is that under Alex's view, Jesus is saying that like he's the created mediator, and like God
Okay.
has glory from eternity. He passes it on to this creature known as the Son, and then the Son passes the glory on to what's it called, like disciples. But what we're saying is that according to Isaiah, like nothing in the current age can have the glory of God. Like that's only going to happen after the end times. So after the end time, like to give you an example, right? You know that one verse about like how nobody is sinless besides God, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So that applies to the here and now, but obviously no one's going to deny that in the afterlife we're going to sin. Like, I mean, nobody's going to say we're going to sin in the afterlife. Like nobody's going to tell us that. Similarly, right, before we fell, there was no sin. So, yeah, so what our point is that Isaiah's claim about God not sharing his glory, that applies to the here and now because we're sinful creatures, right? But the reason why the disciples can receive the glory is because that happens well after the end times and because they achieve theosis. However, in between, there's no room for sharing the glory with creatures. So you can't have Jesus be a creature and have the divine glory and exist at the time of Isaiah speaking that. But according to John, Jesus existed when Isaiah was saying that nobody has the divine glory but God. And so that's why he must be God. And that's why Alex Connor's interpretation fails. But yeah, I think that's sufficient for now. We
Yeah,
can speak
I
on
think we've done overkill. All right, let's keep going.
Hold on, I'll be back in a bit. Just hold up.
All right.
Now,
He might get into the Yael stuff here.
You can play the clip and I'll just comment on it when I come back.
it's difficult to know where to take this because, of course, there is a third really important Christological claim in John's Gospel, which is in chapter 8. I think it might be relevant to talking about the understanding of ancient Jews, and we'll see where this goes. But famously, in chapter 8, Jesus is talking about eternal life, and his Jewish opponents say to him, they challenge him and say, well, our father Abraham, he died. Are you saying you're greater than him? And Jesus replies, if I glorify myself, I glorify, if my glory means something. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, and he was glad. They say, well, you're not even 50 years old, and Abraham has seen you? And he says, truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. Why is that important? Two reasons. Firstly, he seems to claim pre-existence to Abraham, which is pretty significant, but also the invocation of the word I am, Greek ego eimi, which many people think is a callback.
It's lagging so bad that I can't actually watch it. External was, Roy was the only thing holding it together.
Yeah, I think this is good actually because I think Roy had some notes on John 8:58. Yeah, before Abraham was, I am thing, and this is what Alex is about to get into.
All right, I'm back. Did he finish speaking?
He's lagging.
No, it stopped working the instant you left.
Bruh. At what point? I'm trying to look at my notes. Oh, he's going to John 8:58 now.
Yeah,
right?
so that's what I said. It's good that it kind of lagged just because I know you had a lot of notes on that, but yeah, I think one thing I would like to say about this debate, I did say this earlier, but I'd like to say it again so you can hear it, Jack. I think like this debate was really, really good to watch just because both debaters took very, very unconventional approaches. So like David Wood's approach to defending the deity of Jesus, he mainly actually talked about the kind of precedent for like two Yahweh figures in the Old Testament. So he spent most of his time there actually kind of setting up the idea that, okay, Jews had this idea in their heads of figures that could bear the essence and name of Yahweh, and just demonstrate how Jesus kind of fits into that slot. So that was a very unconventional approach. He spent most of his time in the Old Testament. Again, Alex's approach also very unconventional, which I liked. He presupposes the reliability of John's gospel and then demonstrates that even in John's gospel, you can't get to Jesus' divinity, which we would disagree with. I still think it's a good approach nonetheless because it's unconventional.
All right, boys, I'm back. Do we want to share the screen or?
Yeah. Would you all want to do like a part 2 or something after we get through Alex's opening statement, and then we could get to like the cross-examination in a part 2?
I'm down.
I'd be fine with doing it now, or I'd be fine with doing a part 2. It's really up to y'all.
Yeah, well, it's getting we're already at 2 hours, so it might get pretty long if we add the cross-exam. But
It's up to you. I'm fine with going
Yeah.
on.
Well,
for like,
Yeah, let's do the part 2.
we can get through Alex's opening statement.
this was pretty fun. I liked it.
Yeah, for sure. That.
I am that I am who I am. So go and tell them that I am has sent you. It's interesting. Of course, the New Testament is not written in Hebrew, it's written in Greek. And it's well known that the authors of the New Testament were using a Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint. This is something that was pointed out by J.R. Daniel Kirk, so I'm indebted to him for this. If you read the Septuagint that the New Testament writers were using, and we have very good evidence to suggest that John as well is using the Septuagint, how is this verse rendered? Exodus chapter 3. God says to Moses, ego eimi ho on, which means something like, I am the one who is. So go and tell them, ho on has sent you. In other words, in the Greek version, ego eimi is just as it is typically used in Greek, a way of saying, I am. And it's used commonly like this. In John chapter 9, the blind man is healed by Jesus. He runs into town. They say, is this not the man who was born blind? And he says, ego eimi, it's me. When Jesus is asked by the woman at the well says, I'm expecting the Messiah to come. Jesus says, I am he, ego eimi, once again. That is how it is often used. So in the Greek Septuagint, we have I am, ho on, I am the one who is. Go and tell them that ho on has sent you. In the Greek Septuagint, in other words, the abbreviation of the divine name is not ego eimi, it's ho on. It's ego eimi that Jesus says. And in fact, Jesus says the words ego eimi 6 times in chapter 8 of John's Gospel. And yet this is the only time it seems to annoy anybody. Why is that? Well, maybe because it's got more to do with the fact that Jesus seems to be claiming eternality. But supposing for a moment that this really were an invocation of the divine name, I'm just willing to grant it. Let's say, okay, he was meaning to
Can we pause here for a second?
saying, I am.
Yeah, so Alex is basically saying that that the I am who I am in the Septuagint is in Greek haon.
I actually have some slides on that if you want to put them up.
Well, so Alex is basically saying that the I am that I am in Exodus 3 is haon in Greek, and so the own is actually a participle. It literally means like the one existing or the existing one, the one who it's a noun. So basically in grammar, a participle is when you take a verb and basically make it a noun. So what I'm going to counter to that is by saying that if Jesus said before Abraham was haon, that would have been basically him saying before Abraham was the one existing. Okay, it doesn't make any grammatical sense. So if Jesus wants to invoke the divine name but also make grammatical sense, ego eimi is the best thing to use because it's also used in Exodus 3:14. So and God spoke to Moses saying, I am the one who exists, ego eimi haon. So yes, haon is the more direct version of the divine name in the Septuagint, Exodus 3:14, but it wouldn't make grammatical sense for Jews to invoke it there because it's not a verb, it's just a participle. Okay, so we can continue.
Yeah, so on my
Can I say a couple things?
Actually, is there like a link to a Greek interlinear you can send me so I can like?
Yeah, I've got it on my screen. I'll share my screen. I've got a Greek.
Yeah. Okay. Let him share his screen, and then we can get to my slides, and then afterwards, because I think he brings up the whole divine name thing. Do we want to save that for the angel of the Lord stuff, or do we want to save that for now? Because.
So let's wait till he brings up the Yael thing. Okay, so this is the Exodus 3:14 in Septuagint interlinear.
Could I say a couple things on the points he made?
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I would say is that ego eimi in Exodus 3:14 is not the only place it shows up. It also shows up elsewhere in the Greek Septuagint, like in Isaiah 43:10.
Yeah. We're gonna get into that. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Don't worry. We're gonna get into that. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
The other thing is like I've heard this argument that the blind man in the next chapter says ego eimi, but you got to understand context when using it. Like
Craig Keener talks about this, and we're gonna get into that. There's 2 different ways. There's the regular way, and then there's the absolute sense. We're concerned with the absolute sense, and I'm gonna get into that once Drew is done. Okay, so can you Drew, can you highlight the ego eimi in Exodus 3:14 so we can show everyone? Yeah. So as you can see right there, there's ego eimi in Exodus 3:14. So what's important, right, is that as someone already said, right, is that this shows up in Isaiah too, and this actually is the way that God introduces himself in Isaiah. If you pull up the slides again, if Drew's streaming, can he just do it, or does he not have the slides?
Where do you need me to go? Is it the Septuagint?
No. Are you you have my slides, right? Did
Oh
you download my?
yeah.
Yeah, pull up my slides and go to page or slide 16.
Yeah. Oops. Yeah. DM leaks.
Oh, okay. Apollo's got it.
Oh, okay. Just leaked our DM.
So yeah, okay. Go one up. Go one up. Apollos. We just okay. So firstly, yeah. So I just want to mention this. One of y'all can pull it up, but there's actually this good dissertation by Keith Pang that was released like last year, so it's very recent on like the whole I am thing in John, right? And he goes over how this is used in Exodus and how it's used in Isaiah, and just like a full analysis. And basically, it's used in those texts to denote like Yahweh's superiority and ontological uniqueness. It's his way of introducing himself in like places like Isaiah, right? And this is important because that means that John 8:58 doesn't have to be connected to like Exodus 3:14 specifically. And instead, it just has to be connected to the general I am motif in the Old Testament. And this is going to be important because, and this is what Keener points out, and I was going about this earlier, is that there's this absolute sense of the word I am, or the phrase ego eimi. Now, there's a sense in which, like, where the blind man can say I am, right? And where there's like an implied predicate. So, for example, if someone asks you, "Are you blind?" you can say "Ego eimi," I am, right? That's because there's a predicate or implied predicate. But whenever there's no implied predicate or anything like that, it's an "Ego eimi" in the most absolute sense. And when it's in the most absolute sense, that can only be interpreted as a claim of deity. Now, this is important because there's no predicate in John 8. Okay, there's no predicate implied in John 8:58 at all. It's being used in the absolute sense. In other words, it's a divine identity claim. Now, finally, the last point is that Alex O'Connor's like point here doesn't actually prove his position. Like, all he's doing is supposedly refuting an argument from our side, but that doesn't actually prove his position. He needs to go further than that.
Yeah.
So it's just an undercutting defeater.
Yeah, and can I say one more thing about the Greek of John 8:58?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so the Greek is truly, truly, SAT before Abraham was, I am. So the verb for was is aorist. It's a past tense verb. It's a genesthai, so it's past tense. Then Jesus says, before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am. Eimi, the verb for being, is present tense. So it's exceptionally odd that Jesus is doing that. So Jesus is, by making the word eimi present tense, he's highlighting the statement I am in his sentence. He doesn't say truly, SAT before Abraham was, I also was. He doesn't say before Abraham was, I was. He says before Abraham was, I am. So the fact that he changes from past tense to present tense highlights the ego eimi thing. And again, Alex could retort by saying, well, he doesn't say ha'on. Ha'on is the more specific version of the I am that I am in Exodus 3:14 Septuagint, but that wouldn't make grammatical sense if Jesus used ha'on, because ha'on's a participle. It's not a verb. If Jesus said ha'on, it would read, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, the one who exists. Okay, it's a noun. It's not a verb. It doesn't make sense grammatically. Okay, yeah. That was just another note on the grammar.
So go to the where did Apollos go? But if you go to the next slide, I have some other stuff to talk about John 8, right? So the thing is, Alex kind of concedes that, like, okay, fine, maybe it's talking about the divine name, but that still doesn't get you somewhere. And what he says is that, like, okay, the divine name can be given to created beings. And Drew has like a whole like presentation on this specifically. But basically, no, it can't. The divine name can't be given to anyone else. In fact, the whole point of the divine name, or like divine names in general, is to signify uniqueness, right? And like he's gonna try and use this whole idea of, okay, well, creatures can be given the divine name in like Second Temple text. Like there's this article by Williams that goes over this. Like it's more tenuous, we'll put it that way. However, even let's just like concede that for a second. Even if in Second Temple literature that's the case, that would still be inconsistent with the Old Testament. And ultimately, if Alex O'Connor is going to be arguing like inside the New Testament paradigm, he's not going to like you can't accuse the New Testament of being inconsistent with the Old Testament if you're arguing from inside the Christian paradigm. That doesn't work, because that's just like you're moving from an internal critique to an external critique then. But another big issue, right, is that, like, let's say that you could have a creature be endowed with the name Yahweh. The issue is that the name Yahweh can have a referent that's a divine being, and then a referent that's a created being. But they can't be the same being, because a created being and an uncreated being cannot be the same being. Therefore, it follows that you would have two beings. But if there's two beings that are Yahweh, then you have two Yahwehs. But that's just polytheism. So Alex's interpretation like forces you into a polytheist interpretation, which I don't think that John 8 like is giving you a polytheistic interpretation. I don't think that the New Testament authors wanted to suggest that there's two Yahwehs. So we could rule that interpretation on its own. However, right, the issue is that Alex O'Connor's interpretation just doesn't make any sense with the context. So suppose for a second that Jesus is merely claiming to have the divine name, but he's not actually claiming to be like uncreated and like actually God, right? So the question of the Pharisees in John 8:57 can be paraphrased as, how can you claim to have seen Abraham if you're younger than him, i.e. came into being before him? Now, if Jesus' answer to this is just, I have the divine name, and the divine name doesn't signify being God, and creatures can have it, then Jesus hasn't answered the question at all. In fact, Jesus has just said something entirely irrelevant. What would, under the interpretation that Alex O'Connor is taking, what would having the divine name have anything to do with answering the question? Like, literally nothing. Because
Yeah,
under his
we'll
view,
get into this more in a bit, I think.
yeah, like it wouldn't answer anything, because according to Alex O'Connor, you can give like a creature the divine name. So if a creature can have the divine name, then Jesus claiming to have the divine name means literally nothing in relation to the question. But under the Trinitarian view, like it makes perfect sense, because Jesus is asked, how can you claim to have seen Abraham if you're younger than him? And his response is, it's because I'm God. And that response actually makes sense. Like Alex O'Connor's interpretation, I don't think it does. Now, Drew, can you like pull up your slideshow on divine names and just go through that?
Yeah, I think we should wait a bit till we get to the stuff on
Because
Yael.
I think it's best to do it now, and then we can like do it again in part two
Okay.
to like refresh everyone's mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of long though, but I don't know if I'd do the whole thing again. But
Yeah, you could give like a recap at part two.
yeah.
Before that, could I say one more thing before I go? Because I got to get ready for bed, and I'm in an awkward hotel room here. So
Yeah. So what you want
yeah,
to
I
say?
don't know if you guys were going to mention this, but also there's another interesting point on John 8:58. Psalm 90 verse 2 in the Greek Septuagint very closely parallels it. The only difference is just it's you are in the Greek instead of I am, because it's speaking of Yahweh. I don't know if you guys were going to mention that, but that's something interesting also.
Yeah. So like Walton also mentions this in his I think it's in his intro to like Old Testament, or like introducing the Old Testament background. I forgot the exact title. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? It's the one we just read for the thing.
Ancient Near Eastern thought in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I have a copy of it right here. So
Yep.
if we need a
So
reference, yeah.
what he points out is that like the name I am, right? That's like to be. Like it's denoting God's eternity.
yeah.
The whole point of it is to talk about God's eternity.
Yeah.
So that's gonna segue into what you're talking about though. With
and another thing about the John 58 thing, the I am thing. I just got Keener's commentary. He says, when I am lacks even an implied predicate, however, it becomes unintelligible except as an allusion to God's name in the Hebrew Bible or the Septuagint. So like in John 58, there's no like I am Jesus, I am this. No, it's just I am. So that is normally an allusion to the Keener agrees with that. So so I think one thing, so this is my presentation on names now. I think one thing that Alex seems to miss in his opening statement, and he's going to get into this more where he talks about Yael. So basically Yael was a was an angel. He would have been similar to like the same category of thing as like the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. So he's occasionally like blurred. The lines are occasionally blurred with Yahweh in some instances with this angel. And there's one text in particular, the Apocalypse of Abraham, where here I'll just read Heiser's treatment of this. So the angel bears the name of God, Yael. He is in the likeness of a man, and so basically in the Apocalypse of Abraham, you have Yael is essentially, he's called God, he's called the God of Israel, and he appears in the list of like divine names toward the end. So Alex O'Connor actually, he uses this example of Yael as an instance of a figure who bears the divine name but is not God. So, and I think that's a big category error. I don't think that Jews would have had a category. I think that Jews would have viewed this figure, Yael, as kind of the angel of the Lord, as, you know, the Son of Man in Daniel 7, in the same kind of way as they would view other, you know, two powers in heaven type beings. So we talked about this a lot in the intro. And another thing that makes this view impossible is that in Jewish culture, the idea of a name was very similar to an essence. So for somebody to bear the name of something, so like for Yael to bear the name of God, that would have meant bearing the essence of God. So, you know, Alex O'Connor, he's about to say, when he talks about the apocalypse of Abraham, that Yael bears the name of God, but he's not God. So I don't think that's possible. I think that in Jewish culture, a name would have been very, very similar to an essence. And that's what I'm going to argue in these slides. So part one of this is just investigating the ancient Near Eastern context. So this is just background so far. So this is J.M. Plumey and the Cosmology of Ancient Egypt. It was believed that the name of a living being or an object was not just a simple or practical designation to facilitate the exchange of ideas between persons. So it's not just like a label. A name in ancient Egypt was not just a label, but that it was the very essence of what was defined, and that the actual pronouncing of name was to create what was spoken. So, and also John Walton cites this in Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament to demonstrate that this wasn't just ancient Egypt, this was also ancient Israel. Additionally, this is Timothy Seymour and Personal Names and Name Giving in the Ancient Near East. So this is not just ancient Egypt, this is also, you know, Hittites, this is Sumerians, this is Assyrians, this is Israelites, this is the ancient Near East in general. To the ancients, names came to represent far more than mere labels for people and things. Early on, the human impulse to attach names to every aspect of existence led to a peculiar identification of the thing being named and the abstract name itself. Okay, later on, he says, linked to this identity of name and essence is a human tendency to equate one's name with the soul. So the idea is that in the ancient Near East, a person's name kind of represented the fundamental part of them, either represented their essence or their soul. Okay, one more quote. So this is John Botero in his book on Mesopotamia. He has several books, but this one's the most relevant because it's the one we're citing. We have known for a long time that the name in ancient Mesopotamia was not, as in our own view, an epiphenomenon, a pure accident extrinsic to the object. So it's not, in our culture, it's not just a label. The ancient people were convinced that the name has its source not in the person who names, but in the object that is named. That is, it is an inseparable emanation from the object, like a projected shadow, a copy or a translation of its nature. They believed this to such an extent that in their eyes, to receive a name and to exist was one and the same. So again, you have this idea that a person's or a thing's name was equivalent to its essence. And we see this throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. For example, this is a quote from the Enuma Elish. As many of you all probably know, the Enuma Elish is the most, it's the premier Babylonian creation myth. So it basically talks about, Marduk creating the cosmos. So this is how the text describes the pre-creation conditions. Before anything is created, this is how the world is described. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, when no gods whatever had been brought to being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined. So in the Enuma Elish, the uncreated state is described as not having names. Okay, and then the first act of creation, some gods are created, and the first thing is that they're given names. So the idea is that to create something meant to give it a name. Okay, naming and essence were conflated. Additionally, you also see this in ancient Egypt with the Memphite theology. The Ennead of Ptah, so Ennead is just like a kind of like a council, basically would have been the means by which the head god Ptah created the cosmos. The Ennead of Ptah pronounced the name of everything. So again, naming is inherently involved in creation. Okay, so yeah, just to summarize, in ancient Near Eastern culture, a thing's name was equal to a thing's essence. Okay, we don't just see this in ancient Near East, it's also in the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis 1, God assigns names as a part of the creation process. Okay, names also occur after a significant character change. You go from Abram to Abraham, Sarai to Sarah, and Jacob to Israel. Particularly in the Deuteronomistic history, which is a scholarly term for describing the books Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, God's name is a manifestation of the divine presence. So God's name almost acts as like a theophany. So like the name of Yahweh acts as kind of a visual, maybe not necessarily visual, but as like a substitute for the divine presence. It would have represented his presence. So we see this in Deuteronomy 12, 5 through 11. You shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes. So that's the temple. So it's talking about the future building of the temple. You shall seek the place that the Lord will put his name and make his habitation there. So God putting his name there and living there is one and the same. The place that the Lord God will choose to make his name dwell. So God's name is going to dwell in the temple. Okay, is this talking about, YHWH being written on the temple? No, it's talking about God dwelling there. The name is God. The name is God's presence. Okay, we see this again in 1 Kings 3, 3 through 5. You know that David, my father, could not build a house for the name of the Lord. I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord. This again is talking about the temple. And scholars recognize this. So this is a quote. These are quotes from H.B. Huffman in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. Great scholarly publication. Highly recommend it. God's name, which in some traditions is specifically revealed, can become a separate aspect of God in such a way as to represent God as a virtual hypostasis. So the name of God is a hypostasis. Okay, that's almost Trinitarian language. God's name has become virtually an independent entity, separate from God, i.e. a hypostasis, yet the name does not become a fully separate entity, as the temple cult, so that's Jerusalem. So the temple worship is offered in the presence of the Lord, not in the presence of the name of the Lord. So the name of the Lord is both God in the sense that the worship to is offered in the presence of the Lord, not in the presence of the name of the Lord. The name of the Lord is not a separate deity, but it's a separate manifestation of God's presence. So the name of God is the presence of God. Okay, we see this also in Isaiah, as well as in I have Septuagint texts as well. So behold, the name of the Lord, so Septuagint translates that as Anama Kuriu. So just to demonstrate that the Septuagint is tracking with this. The Septuagint does not replace the name of the Lord with something easier to understand. The Septuagint keeps this theology of God's name being God's identity, or God's essence. So behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger and in thick rising smoke. His lips are full of fury, and his tongue is like a developing fire. So the name of the Lord is God, is God's essence. Okay. Similarly, Psalm 21 says, may the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. Okay, and the Septuagint also continues this idea. The Septuagint doesn't replace it with something easier. The Septuagint also keeps the idea that God's essence is God's name. Okay, again, so we also see this with Exodus 23, 20 through 23. Behold, I send an angel. So this is talking about the angel of the Lord, who we've kind of referenced before. Behold, I send an angel before you. He will not pardon your transgression for my name. Okay, same thing in the Septuagint, same idea. The Septuagint is not making this easier. It's keeping the same theology. For my name is in him. So God's presence, God's essence is in the angel. The angel of the Lord shares the name or the essence of God. Okay, David Wood talked about in this opening, this forms the basis for Trinitarian thought in the New Testament. Okay, so this isn't just in the Old Testament as well. Intertestamental literature has these same ideas too. So Psalms of Solomon, which would have been dated around like 2nd to 1st century BC. There's still some debate on it, but Psalms of Solomon 7:5 says, when your name dwells among us, we will be shown mercy. Again, it's not talking about YHWH, the actual name. It's talking about the essence of God. It's talking about God himself. Odes 3:8 says, you who shackled the seas by the word of your command, who sealed it by your awesome and honorable name. Okay, the name of God, the literal Hebrew consonants is not a weapon. It's talking about God's essence. Okay, it's talking about God himself. God himself shackled the oceans. Okay, not a string of letters. Okay, so yeah, in the Hebrew Bible and intertestamental literature, God's name was a substitute for God's essence or presence. Okay, so Jesus in the New Testament is portrayed as the name of God. John 17:6, Jesus says, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. Jesus has manifested God's presence to the people, to his disciples. Okay, Jesus has God's presence, and he's manifesting it to them. Romans 10, 9 through 11. So this is really significant because Romans 10, the book of Romans, one of the earliest New Testament documents we have. So this is very, very early Christology in Romans, okay? If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved, okay? So Paul is saying that you will be saved if you confess to Jesus, if you call out to Jesus, okay? How does he defend this statement? He says, for everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Okay, that's a quotation from the book of Joel. Paul is equating the name of the Lord in Joel with the name of Christ. Okay, Jesus has the name of God. He is the name of God. He has the essence of God. Okay, we also see this in Acts. So Acts 40 through 41 says they beat them. These are the apostles. The Jewish leaders are beating the apostles. The Jewish leaders beat the apostles and charged them not to speak in the name of Jesus. They, the apostles, left the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. Okay, the name of who? It's Hashem. Okay, if you have Jewish friends, they might refer to, out of reverence for not saying the name Yahweh, they might replace it with Hashem. That's a very old practice, and it means the name. They would just say the name. Okay, the name on its own was a way of referring to God. Okay, you also see this in 3 John 7. They have gone out, this is referring to missionaries in the Johannine community. They have gone out for the sake of the name. Okay, again, the name of who? The name. It's Hashem. It's the divine name. It's the thing that Jews would say to avoid saying Yahweh. Okay, and C.K. Barrett in the International Critical Commentary on Acts 1 through 4. Okay, this is not like a conservative commentary series. He says, the Jews used Hashem, or the name, to avoid saying God. The Christians took this up for Jesus because they thought of Jesus as God. Okay, so Jesus is the name of God, which, as we've shown from the Hebrew Bible, from the ancient Near East, from intertestamental literature, from the time of Jesus, the name, or a name, would have been viewed as an essence. Okay, so summary. Though the New Testament does not depict Jesus as the same person as God the Father, okay, it doesn't depict them as the same person, it nonetheless depicts them as sharing the same name, which, as demonstrated, meant essence or presence. Okay, Jesus and God are different people, but they share the same name, which means essence or presence. This is very Trinitarian language that we're using. Okay, that's all I've got for the name stuff.
Yeah. So, do you actually want to end it like here, or how do you want to do it? Because
I think we should finish Alex's opening statement because he's still going to go into the Yael stuff.
That's a good point. But we kind of covered everything we could for the Yahuwah stuff, I think.
Yeah, but I think we should kind of finish watching it, and I'll kind of remind.
I mean, there's one last thing that I'd ask you to pull up. It's the dissertation I was talking about I Am and John. Keith Pangs. Have you read it, or?
I have not.
I don't think I've shared it that much. I'll send it to you right now. Here, check your notifications. I mean, I think you should at least show it on screen so people can go look it up later on.
Yeah, I'm not screen sharing anymore, but yeah, I'll screen share again.
Here, let's see how much longer we have until we get to.
Yeah, so Ego in Me and the Surpassing Greatness of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of John. This is a dissertation from Liberty University by Keith Kekoa Pang. So if y'all want that, you got it.
Yeah, I think that's where the bulk of my stuff that I've said about John 8:58 would come from.
Yeah. All right, cool. Yeah, we can go ahead and finish Alex's opening statement. I think it's almost done.
It should be, yeah.
And I think what about the stuff about the name theology that I just said should kind of cover his next thing, because what he's going to do is he's going to bring up Yael and the Apocalypse of Abraham as an example of someone who is called Yahweh, he bears the name of Yahweh, but is not Yahweh. And I've demonstrated that wouldn't have really been a category for ancient Jews because they equated name with essence.
There's really like 2 more points that I've saved in my notes that he makes. Like he just goes on to deny that Christ is the angel of the Lord, and he goes to, like, Hebrews, and then like God Logic brings
Hebrews
up
1.
Hebrews, yeah, and then God Logic brings up how in Hebrews 11:23-6 it actually supports the view that Jesus is the angel, and he kind of concedes. I don't want to say he definitely does. And then
Oh
like the
yeah, I
last
think I
point,
saw that.
yeah. And then lastly, he points out that like in Acts 6, Stephen doesn't point out that Jesus is the angel of Yahweh, despite the fact that he brings up the whole angel of Yahweh. But like that seems to be an argument from silence.
Yeah.
He then cites Augustine, but like
Augustine's not a
Augustine's
biblical
views are more
scholar.
complicated. Augustine's views are more complicated, and either way, like Augustine is going to be way later than the New Testament and the Old Testament, and he's going to be way later than the earlier fathers. I guess you could like point out, like, oh yeah, this is we pointed out John 1:18 and the theophany problem. If Jesus is Yahweh visible, then it's going to follow that he's the angel of the Lord, because that's the place the angel of the Lord took, right? So that alone tells us that Jesus is the pre-existent angel of the Lord in the Old Testament. But also in Colossians 1:15, it says that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And if Jesus, let's suppose for a second that Jesus isn't the one represented in the theophanies, where like the angel of the Lord appears. Well, then that statement doesn't seem to be true, because then the angel of the Lord is the image of Yahweh, like he's the image of the invisible God. So it seems that the only way to make Colossians 1:15 make sense is if Jesus is that person who is revealed in the theophanies.
Yeah. Want to go and finish the opening statement? I think we're almost done. And
Because like,
we've
I'm
talked.
covering the points he makes right now, and
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be
we
good
could-
just to kind of watch through it.
yeah.
And then we'll just pause and be like,
Yeah.
yeah, we already talked about this, and then keep.
All right. Hopefully, I don't crash here.
All right. If we
I'll
can't,
just,
that's
like-
okay.
Oh, I have like 2 more things left on my notes. Let's see. Oh yeah, he tries to like say that the Gospel of John is like drawing on a Jewish source with like an angel speaking to Abraham. I don't think that works. Carson and Moo in their intro to the New Testament mentioned how like it's kind of hard to dig behind John's sources and like try to find his literary sources. So I'm not too confident in that.
Yeah, it is. John seems to kind of pull from a web of ideas, not necessarily one source. So like I think mainly back to like his Logos Christology. It's like that there's so many different like networks that it doesn't seem like he's drawing on Philo. I think it'd be weird if he drew on Philo, just because Philo's so late. And even if you date John to like the
I also
late,
have
even if you date John to the late first century, it'd be weird if he was pulling directly from Philo.
I think I have like I forgot if it's like a doctoral dissertation or if it's like a master's thesis, but there's also something on like John's use of logos, which goes into how he's drawing from multiple sources.
Yeah, I went on a research rabbit hole with that recently.
Yeah, but anyways, it's like I don't think that works. Finally, he talks about like John 8 and like how the Jews commonly misinterpret Jesus's claims, and we already went over that. Let's be real.
Yeah.
I don't think they misinterpret it when you look at it contextually. At least not in John 8 and John 10.
Oh yeah, Jolly Richard says I've seen J. Dyer say John is pulling from the wisdom books. That's a great observation, but the wisdom books is not one particular piece, like one particular book. John is pulling from a network of literature, and that network of literature largely is the wisdom literature. So John pulls from Wisdom of Solomon. He pulls from say Sirach to get his Logos Christology. It's not just like one source, and that was the point that we're making.
Yeah, and when we say literary sources, we're not including the Old Testament, because obviously the Old Testament is a source for John. We mean like other gospels, other traditions of that sort, right?
I think we should finish the Alex's opening statement. It shouldn't take long.
Argument.
Yeah.
It's like then finally the last argument I think he makes is like in Acts 6, Stephen is stoned for blasphemy, and yet Stephen isn't claiming to be God. I mean, maybe, but like.
Yeah, I mean that at most that just demonstrates that like
Yeah, that just seems like a red herring to me. I don't see what that proves.
It's not a red herring because it demonstrates that, like, okay, Jesus was accused of blasphemy, therefore they thought Jesus was God. It's like that's not necessarily the case, but
yeah, we go a little more. Oh yeah, and then he uses the argument where like, oh, the Father is just commonly referred to as Theos without any like disambiguation, and then is distinguished from Jesus. I mean, sure, but like the monarchical Trinitarian interpretation like has no issues with that. I'm gonna go into that once the finishes because I want to go more in depth into that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll play the clip and then I'll go more into depth into monarchical Trinitarianism and how it explains that better.
All right, here goes nothing.
Here we have to understand, as David is quite right to point out, cultural context of early Judaism. And there is a tradition in early Jewish texts, or at least texts of around the contemporary times, Gospels, of endowing beings who are not Yahweh with Yahweh's name. And thereby enabling
you might want to like put this at 2 times speed since we already covered like a lot of that.
So we already covered why, there's no such thing as like a being who is not Yahweh but bears the divine name, because the name would have been essence. And he's going to give Yael as an example, but Yael would have been, in our view, Yael would have been viewed as bearing the essence of God. He would have been the same kind of being as the angel of the Lord, which David brought up.
Yeah, just one other thing, right? Saying that a being has the name Yahweh but isn't Yahweh is nonsensical. Think of it this way. Drew has the name Mark, but he's not Mark. Like, what does that even mean? Like, if you say if someone has the name Drew or Mark, then you're saying that person is Mark or Drew. Like, that's just how names work. Like, if something has some name, you can refer to them as that name, and you can say this person is, and then you can say their name. That's the whole point of a name in the first place. Yeah. So saying that like you have a being who, like, if something isn't Yahweh, then it doesn't have the name Yahweh.
Yeah. All right, we can continue. I just wanted to summarize what we talked about earlier, just because Alex is bringing it up now.
All right, 2 times speed, and we should be good.
The angel of Yahweh, and there is the suggestion that the angel of Yahweh is Jesus. That doesn't make any sense to me. For a start, if you turn to Hebrews chapter 1, the very first verse says, "In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son." In these last days. If Jesus is the angel of the Lord, way back in Exodus, the story of the Exodus, why is it that Hebrews says he's only spoken to us through the Son in the last few days? Likewise, in Acts chapter 6.
Hold on, pause it there. So I was talking about this earlier, but first of all, Hebrews 11, Hebrews 11 basically does say that Jesus was revealed in Old Testament times. Let me just read it out for you real quick. Where is it? Hebrews 11. Where did it go? But like God Logic, he brings this up in like the Q&A, right? And I think he kind of concedes, and we'll get to that, right? So
yeah, we'll do that tomorrow if we decide to do a part 2.
I want to get Than in here. You want to I want to schedule a Than and see what we can do.
Yeah.
I think Alex O'Connor actually responded with
a comment.
Yeah, his objections to what he said.
I think that God Logic and him kind of started out. But the issue is, right, Hebrews 11:23-6 kind of just says that Moses like suffered for Christ. And the issue is, right, if Christ wasn't there, then how does that work? So that's what God Logic's objection amounts to, right? It's obviously going to be more than that. But with Hebrews 1, right, it just says that God has spoken to us in the last days through his sons. It doesn't say that there is in no sense in which God spoke to us through his son. It's just that, like, it wasn't as explicit. Like, I don't think that... Yeah. Like, I don't think that,
the primary prophet was not the angel of the Lord. In previous eras of Israelite history, the primary prophet would have been Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, Elijah. They would have been the primary prophet, not the angel of the Lord. Now, in the New Testament times, it is the second power who is the primary prophet, so to speak. In addition, another thing I'd like to bring up with Hebrews 1 is that verse 2 says that the Son was the means by which God created the world. So, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, through whom he created the world. So, you know, this. Wait, I'm not done. So this claims that Jesus was interacting with the world at creation. Okay,
Yeah, so
so
if the sun wasn't there, how does that work? But another thing,
well,
right?
I was also going to say that like this claims that Jesus has been interacting with the world ever since creation. So if Alex thinks that Jesus speaking through the prophets means that the angel of the Lord, the second power, can't interact with the world at all, then it's like, well, that doesn't make sense because the angel or the second power interacts with the world through creation. So
Yep. But also, like, so back what we were just saying about like the primary prophet. Notice how it says, after God spoke long ago in various portions and in various ways to our ancestors through the prophets, in these last days He has spoken to us in a Son. Right. So the issue is, notice like the plural, right? Because when you look at the angel of the Lord, he usually appears to like few people, like very few people. Like, for example, he appears to Sarah. He appears to Hagar. Or I don't know if he appears to Sarah, but I know
he never would have addressed. Yeah, the angel of Yahweh never addressed Israel corporately. It's only until now that the
Yep.
angel or the second power is addressing everyone.
Plus, it never actually like denies that, you know, the angel ever like think about it. It just says God spoke to us through our ancestors, and in these last days He spoke to us through His Son. That doesn't actually deny that He spoke ever through His Son in the past. So that it just doesn't seem to follow.
Yeah, totally. All right, let's clear it up. Let's finish.
I guess like the last thing you could point out is that like Hebrews 1 technically, like it says that the Son is superior to angels, and some people use that to say that He's not the angel of the Lord. We can just distinguish between an ontological angel and like a functional angel, or an angel by relation. So
Yeah.
Hebrews 1 is
So Heiser talks about like by the time the New Testament was written, the word, like Malachim or Angelos, had already evolved to kind of denote not just a function, but like a more subordinate status in the divine council. So
yeah, so there's two meanings. There's the meaning of just a messenger, which is just a term of relation, right? So in that sense, Jesus has to be an angel because Jesus is portrayed as a messenger. So Jesus has to be an angel in that sense, but he's not an angel in this new evolved sense of the word angelos or malach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And in it, he says that an angel spoke to Moses through the burning bush, not Jesus, but a messenger of Yahweh.
Yeah, we already
It's a little bit strange, but suppose we just accept that the angel of Yahweh is a bit difficult to unpack. Augustine himself, by the way, said that the angel is correctly termed an angel if we consider him himself, but equally correct, he is termed the Lord because God dwells in him. What does that mean?
Yeah, we already covered that.
I think it's an indication of the divine name. This is most elucidated for me when we turn to non-scriptural Jewish writings around the same period. For example, in 3rd Enoch, Metatron is called the little Yahweh, invoking the divine name, and in fact to the extent that the Talmud warns Jews not to confuse Metatron with Yahweh, because that seems to be the implication of.
Real quick, there's good indications that the original text actually doesn't contain the identification of Enoch as the son of man, but that it's actually an interpolation. But anywho, another video for another day.
Yeah, I don't know much about Enoch, so I can't. I don't know much about like Enoch studies, so I can't comment on that. That's more like Drew's area.
Invoking the name. The most important example of this for me is the Apocalypse of Abraham, written around the same time as the Gospels. A Jewish text which tells the story of Abraham, who hears the voice of God, and he's terrified and he hits the ground. And he hears the voice of God speaking to an angel. And he speaks to an angel saying, "Go, Yahuel," that's the name of the angel, "of the same name, through the mediation of my ineffable name, consecrate this man for me and strengthen him against his trembling. Through the mediation of my divine name, which he's given to the angel Yahuel." Yahuel, by the way, Yah and El. It is a substitute for the ineffable name of Yahweh, the writing of which is forbidden. And that's why he's called Yahuel. And in fact, at one point, God is himself addressed as Yahuel in this text. Abraham is told by this angel Yahuel, "Stand up, Abraham, go without fear. Be right glad and rejoice, for I am with you. For eternal honor has been prepared for you by the Eternal One. I have appointed to be with you, and the generation prepared for you." So the angel, invoking the divine name, by the way, says to Abraham, "Rejoice, for I'm preparing for you, essentially, redemption, and it will come from your generation." And by the way, when Abraham finally stands up, one of the descriptions of Yahuel's appearance is that his hair is white like snow. Where have we heard that before? But interesting, isn't it? Let's think about the context of John 8:58. A lot of people forget that we're talking about Abraham. Why are we talking about Abraham? Why is it here that Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am"?
Yeah, so we could probably skip this part because all he's doing right now is just like he's trying to say that like this is the source or like it's a potential source, but we already went into that.
Yep. I don't think we should skip it. I think we should be charitable. Okay,
that's fair.
But I mean, I was gonna say we already talked about this Yahuel thing. Alex O'Connor gives Yahuel as an example of a figure who would have the divine name but not be Yahweh, and I demonstrate that that's not the case, because, you know, a name in essence would do the same thing. And also, so Michael Heiser, in his book on angels, this is also in his dissertation too, he basically goes through examples of the second power in heaven figure. Okay, so remember, second power in heaven is a figure who is called Yahweh, bears the essence of Yahweh, but is still a distinct person from Yahweh. So he gives examples of kind of manifestations of this figure throughout the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple literature. And in the chapter on Second Temple literature, he gives Yahuel in the Apocalypse of Abraham as an example. All right, we can continue.
Yeah, you can start it now.
Well, if I'm right that he is just identifying himself, and the thing that's important is the Abraham claim, could this stem from a similar tradition? This is what Andrew Perryman has suggested recently, that when he says, I mean, this whole thing gets kicked off because Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. Well, hold on a second. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, the angel Yahuel says to Abraham, rejoice, for from your generation will come one who will redeem you. So is it possible that a common tradition has Jesus referring to the fact that Abraham rejoiced to see his day because he was promised this redemption from the beginning of time? It's possible. It's a suggestion. I think it's quite an interesting one. But it is a little strange that Jesus claims to be pre-existent. He uses the present tense, I am. It's worth bearing in mind that the Bible sometimes does this when it is talking about plans that are preordained from the beginning of time. For example, in Revelation chapter 13, we hear about the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. It's talking about Jesus there. Jesus wasn't crucified at the beginning of the world. But it talks about it almost in the present tense, or at least as if it happened there and then. Why? Because the plan for this redemption through the Lamb was set in stone from the beginning of time.
Yeah,
so it talks about it as if it's in the present tense. Similarly, famously.
So he's conflating when the operation is first done with when the effect is completed, right? The issue is that like, let's say that God's decree that Jesus will be crucified, right? When that's predestined, let's just say that happens before the creation of the world, right? Let's take his interpretation of Revelation. Yeah, that doesn't follow, sure, that it's therefore going to happen at the same time. The issue is that with the I am statements, it's not saying that Jesus is causing something and then the effect of that cause is going to happen later. It's just a claim about his state of being as he is currently. So that doesn't work.
In the book of Jeremiah, God says to the prophet Jeremiah, before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. He also says, before you were born, I consecrated you as a prophet. How can you consecrate someone as a prophet who doesn't exist yet? That means that Jeremiah must be pre-existent, right? He must be, no, not necessarily. It just means that God had this plan. It's a poetic way of saying that God already knew what was going to happen and had planned this from the beginning of time. So putting all of this together, there is an interesting interpretation of Jesus saying that Abraham rejoices in my day. And the Jews not understanding him, not getting it. He says, like, before Abraham was, I am. I am the fulfillment that was promised to Abraham and was from the beginning of time, and here I am. Now, of course, this is all exegesis, and it's a little sort of spotty. But the most important question is probably about blasphemy. David mentioned blasphemy in a different context earlier. Why is it that they pick up stones to stone him to death? Because, of course, if I'm looking for a sound exegesis of correctly interpreting the words of Jesus, I turn to his Jewish opponents, who consistently throughout the Gospels are always understanding him correctly. No, the theme of the Gospels, especially John's Gospel, is how comprehensively the Jews misunderstand what Jesus is saying. When he says, I and the Father are one, they say, you're claiming to be God. And he said, no, not getting it. When he says that he forgives sins, and they say, who can forgive sins but God alone? He says, you're not understanding it. And hopefully we can get into that, actually. And here, of course, when they say,
that's presupposing
we're going to stone
you.
Yeah, I don't. We don't agree with that, obviously. Like, he's kind of just assuming that they're always wrong, but I don't know for sure. Sometimes they very much understand what he's saying. They just don't like it. Like, what's it called? There's this one scene in the Gospels where Jesus asked them the question of whether John's baptism was like from heaven, right? You know what I'm talking about, right, Drew?
Yeah, that's in John.
Yeah, and from what I can tell, it's like they understand. Let me pull up the passage because I'm quoting off of memory with that one. Let me pull up the passage so I don't get it wrong. Yeah, so it's in Matthew 21, 23 to 7, right? So he asked them, where did John's baptism come from, heaven or from the people? And right, they said that if we say from heaven, he will say, why did you not believe them? If he says from people, then the crowd will be mad at him because they consider John a prophet. So clearly they understand what Jesus is saying, and they know what he's doing. They just don't like what he's doing. And there's plenty of other places where that's the case, right? Especially like whenever Jesus challenges their, like traditions.
not told exactly what blasphemy they think he's committed. Do we now just think that they got it right, that they correctly understood what he was saying? I'm not so sure. Especially considering that if you look in Acts again, I've already mentioned Acts 6, this is Stephen. Stephen is telling the story of the Jews to the Jewish authorities who he's been brought before on charges of blasphemy. He's eventually stoned to death. Why? Because he has a vision. In Acts 7, filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. that is God, not the Father. Look, he said, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, the Jews cover their ears, run up to him, and stone him to death. Notice the similarity, by the way, between this depiction, looking up and seeing the Son of Man sat at the right hand of God, stood at the right hand of God in this case, and the claim that Jesus makes in his trial. It's quite interesting. Stephen is stoned to death for this. Did Stephen claim that Jesus was God here? Did Stephen claim that he was God here? Sometimes Christians act as if the only way to commit blasphemy is to claim to be God. That is simply not the case. In fact, in Acts chapter 6, we're told that Stephen has been fraudulently accused of blasphemy. They're making up...
I mean, maybe Stephen claims someone else is God. Just a thought.
Yeah. I think David Wood brings this up in his rebuttal.
That's just a kind of a snag remark.
Yeah, David Wood brings that up in his rebuttal, that they only get angry at Stephen. Like, Stephen is constantly, like, criticizing them for, being wrong and rejecting the prophets. But it's only when they say that, it's only when Stephen says that Jesus is at the right hand of the Father, right? That's when they get mad. That's when they pick up the stones.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, yeah.
Yeah, you'll see that when he goes into it.
Yeah.
I mean, either way, like, we kind of covered this. It's kind of, what he's doing here is just kind of a red herring. I don't know where it came from.
Let's finish the opening statement.
Charges against him. Here are the charges that they throw at him to bring him before the court for blasphemy. This man never stopped saying things against this holy place and the law. We've heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses has handed on to us. Ladies and gentlemen, if changing the customs that Moses has handed on to us is enough to get somebody convicted of blasphemy, I'm not sure we should read too deeply into the accusations of blasphemy against Jesus.
Well, actually,
there's so much to say.
Well, wait, wouldn't only God be the one who would be able to change the covenant?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. Like, I was about to say that because Simon Gathercole makes this point in his book about, like, the pre-existence of Jesus. You know that one passage, like Mark 10:18, right? At the end of that passage, Jesus takes the place of lawgiver. And what Simon Gathercole points out is that the context of this passage and that role he's taking only makes sense if Jesus has the authority of God. If Jesus is God, then that makes sense. If Jesus is not God, then that doesn't really make sense, because lawgiver, in the sense that Jesus is claiming to in Mark 10, doesn't really make sense. And maybe for part 2, I can get the direct quote, but right now I don't have it. I'm going off the record. Yeah.
Real quick, I just wanted to say, he was talking about blasphemy, about like breaking the commandments. That's not at all, though, the scene that we get with Mark 14:62. It's specifically about Jesus' identity.
Yeah, and we're claiming that actually in Mark 14, Jesus is claiming to be God. Because he's claiming to be that Son of Man figure in Daniel 7, who we discussed previously, fits into that second power slot. And the second power would have been, Yahweh, not Yahweh, same essence, different person.
Well, everything I want to respond to, we have rebuttal periods, so if I haven't responded to everything David has said, hopefully I'll get the opportunity then. But this idea of the divine name being invested into people and them having the authority of God without being Yahweh themselves is, I think, the important ticket here. One slightly less biblical example is a story recorded by Josephus, which came to mind when David was speaking. When Alexander the Great approaches Jerusalem in an attempt to conquer it, the crisis is averted. When a priest whose mitre bears the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, bears the name of God, comes out, and what does Alexander do? He bows down before the priest. Was Alexander bowing down before the priest? Or was he bowing down to the divine name that was in him? When every knee will bow to Jesus, what is the context? Jesus has been given the name that is above all other names.
For this, I think for this Josephus example, given what we've already talked about before, with the second power in heaven, the name meaning essence, the name meaning God's presence, this figure in Josephus bowing down to the priest probably thought that the priest would have been some manifestation of the second power in heaven, because there are speculations in like, I think in the Dead Sea Scrolls of like the second power in heaven being like a human figure. This is also in Daniel 7, because one like a son of man. One like a son of man can also mean like one like a human being, because son of man would have been a common term for human people. So yeah, there would have been speculations of the second power in heaven being a human person. So actually, the figure in Josephus bowing down to the priest who has the divine name actually isn't that unexpected. They probably thought the priest was a second power in heaven, a Yahweh, not Yahweh figure. All right, we can keep going.
I mean, I was going to add, though.
This is a common thing.
I was just going to say, right, it's that Alex says that is the person bowing down to the priest, or is he bowing down to the divine name? Well, if he's bowing down to the priest, then that's idolatry. And if he's bowing down to the divine name, then he's not bowing down to the priest. The issue is that it's not that they're like, he mentions Philippians 2 and like how everyone will bow to the knee, like
like bow their knee to Jesus, right? The issue is that they're not bowing their knee to the divine name in that phrase. They're bowing their knee to Jesus. And so if Jesus is not God, then that's idolatry. So I don't see how his exegesis works. But we're gonna get more into Philippians 2 next time because I have some stuff saved on that.
All right.
Thing. And so David's right that we need to understand how the early Jews were interpreting the various verses that we were reading, but I don't think it lends too nicely to his interpretation. Jesus is constantly talking as if he's not speaking with his own authority. He's doing this all the time. The most instructive example for me is in John 12:44, when Jesus cries out, "Whoever believes in me, believes not in me, but in the one who sent me." That's if you read the NRSV. The NIV adds in the word only. Whoever believes in me, believes not in me only, but in the one who sent me. That word simply isn't in Greek. It's a little bit strange. I want to talk more about that. I want to talk about authority and where it comes from. I want to talk about the forgiving of sins. I want to talk about worship for sure. And whichever one of those roads we go down is essentially up to David's word. But I'm ready for any of them, so we'll see what comes up. Thank you for listening.
I mean, the whole point about like only, like statements about like, say, for example, only the Father is this, even the Trinitarian can make those statements. And it's because of how the unity of the divine essence works. So,
yeah,
like, for example,
Jesus, the Son proceeds from the Father. His authority is derived from the Father.
yeah, exactly. So we can say only the Father is God, only the Son is God, only the Holy Spirit is God. And that makes sense because of the unity of being, right? It's not like this, like you can say, I don't know, Job isn't God, only the Father is God. You can say something like that because it's not like the Son and Spirit are separate gods from the Father. They're the same God. And even the name Father itself implies the Son, so you're already including the Son in it. And because the Father inspires the Spirit, you're also including the Spirit in it. So, like, you can have these statements because of the unity of essence. But, like, one thing he kind of gets into is, like, how in Acts 6, Jesus is distinguished from God, like the Father, and how the Father is just called God with no disambiguation. I think the monarchy of the Father solves this. To put it simply, I'll explain it from a more Thomist perspective.
We can wait till he actually gets into it. Maybe save it for tomorrow. But...
I don't think he ever gets into it. I think he gets into it a little bit at the end, so I guess I can go into it there. But to put it simply, we have certain titles which are common to all three persons that are appropriated specifically to one. So, for example, the title Lord.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, the title Lord is appropriated to Jesus. Jesus is called the one Lord. Jesus is called the only Lord, and so forth. And yet, clearly, the Father is Lord and the Spirit is Lord. The reason why is because we can appropriate certain titles to a specific person because of their role in, like, the economy and because of their role in procession. So, the Son is the one who is, like, who becomes incarnate, and that has to do with why we call him Lord.
Yeah.
Similarly, the Father is, like, the source of the Son and the Spirit. The Son is begotten, the Spirit is spirated. And so because of that, we can appropriate the title God, especially to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Because it sort of mirrors or parallels the way that God is created to creatures. This isn't to say that the Son or the Spirit is a creature, but rather there's a parallel.
Mm-hmm.
So we can appropriate the title specifically to God, the Father.
Yeah.
And so therefore, you're going to commonly see the word God just applied to the Father with no disambiguations. And that's not really an issue for Trinitarians. If it was, then you could make the argument, oh, why is the Son commonly called Lord and, like, with no disambiguation and then distinguished from the Father? It's not because the Father, but you wouldn't conclude from that therefore the Father isn't Lord. You just
so
conclude that
like
there's
Paul
an appropriation.
says, like Paul says, and I think he's quoting an earlier creed of, like, for us there is one God, the Father, for whom are all things, and one Lord, Jesus Christ. People say, like, oh, one God and one Lord are distinguished, Jesus isn't God in this verse, but, like, okay, is the Father also not Lord? It's like if Jesus is not God in 1 Corinthians 8:6, then the Father is also not Lord in that verse, which doesn't really make sense for you to say.
Yeah, I think that's good enough for now.
Yeah, that's pretty much all of Alex's opening statement. I think we could do some summaries of it. Like, I thought it was really good. I'm really glad that he kind of took a different approach. I think it was really interesting how he kind of presupposed the reliability of John, and kind of demonstrated or tried to demonstrate that Jesus isn't God, even through presupposing the reliability of John. But again, I think he missed a lot of the Second Temple Jewish context of, like, the two powers in heaven. I think he missed a lot of the name theology. But yeah, I think he did a good job. I liked it.
Yeah, I'd say that overall they're definitely presenting the more high tier arguments. It's not like low tier stuff that you'll commonly see on both sides. It's
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
more
I
high tier
mean,
stuff.
you can tell Alex did a lot of research on
Yeah,
maybe the
like I
Apocalypse
was
of Abraham. I thought
surprised
that was really interesting. So
because Alex is like by training a philosopher, right? Same with
yeah,
David Wood. It's kind of strange that they like got very much into this because usually, right, the philosophers kind of fumble theology and like biblical theology especially, but
yeah,
these guys don't. So I'm
yeah. Well,
I'd say
I
that
think it could have been better on both sides, but I think I wish
yeah,
David Wood kind of went more into like.
Old Testament.
Well, no, I think he did a great job presenting the Old Testament. I think he went. I think he should have gone into more specific examples of. I think he should have talked more about Mark 14:62. So that because Mark is the earliest gospel, and because you have this statement is also mentioned in Matthew's gospel, you have that makes it more likely it's a statement from the historical Jesus. I'd also, if I was David Wood, I also probably would have gone more into like Romans and the Pauline letters, where you have Jesus as the second power in heaven in Paul's letters, very, very early Christology, because it's very early. That makes it more likely it comes from the historical Jesus. So yeah, I think it was really good overall. I'm really glad that this kind of scholarship is being exposed to a broader audience, like Ruslan GP's audience.
I guess we're gonna cover this next time, but this kind of goes into why there's like I don't know if you guys are keeping up, but there's this whole idea of like especially like Muslims will argue this where they'll say that the New Testament teaches Arianism and that like Jesus is Yahweh in a lesser sense. They'll argue that's what the New Testament teaches. I think with what Drew covered, that's just not possible.
Yeah, I mean same essence, so same
Yeah,
name.
like
Same essence.
you can't have the divine name and not have the same essence. That's not possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll just post my. Well, you guys already know my YouTube. It's Imago-Logos. That's all of our YouTube except for Apollos, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So let me go ahead and share your guys' YouTube channel. What interesting projects are you guys up to in the near future?
So we're trying to get like some unique stuff out there. I have my own like solution to the problem of evil that Cryptic voiced over for the script
Really?
that I'm gonna be releasing soon.
Yep.
So the first video you're seeing is who wrote the Gospels, where I basically covered the titles. My argument is that you can get an attribution of authorship from the titles themselves, like without looking at the church tradition or like actually going internal to the text besides the titles. Because I don't think people really focus on that a lot. They'll kind of focus more on church testimony and then like
Yeah.
internal evidence. But I think you can like you can argue that the titles were original and then from there argue that they're accurate. Then we have Sam's video, does Romans teach adoptionism, where he just goes into a quick passage, and then there's the whole point about what scripture was Paul citing in 1 Corinthians 15:4, and he thinks it's somewhere in Leviticus. I forgot the exact passage. Sam, do you remember?
It's Leviticus 23, 9 through 14, like the Feast of Feast Fruits.
Yeah, and then there's the first video we made, refuting the logical problem of the Trinity. That's me and Cryptic again, who made that.
Yep.
Two. There's no simple way to lay it out here, but it gets into like some complex logic and philosophy stuff. So if you're interested in that, I would check it out.
I actually do have a question about that video.
Yeah, what about it?
I know you included this other interpretation in order to solve the logical problem of the Trinity, but then just concluded that it kind of collapses into heresy. Why did you include that one?
Which one? Social
I'm trying to
Trinitarianism?
remember which one. Yeah, that one. Yeah, that one.
The reason why I included it is because of the fact that like people use it a lot, and I just want to point out that it just fails. Plus, I was reading Bo Branson at that time when I was like doing the research for that video, and he gave that critique of social Trinitarianism, and I wanted to include it.
Yeah.
All right. So that
I
was
think
our
Jolly Ranchers. I know who that is. That's SZN from the community. But
Okay.
I don't think there's not enough time to. He wanted me to drop the Thebes and Athens example. That's from the logical problem of the Trinity video, which that's gonna take forever to drop. I can't drop it here, man. I'll make a video on it eventually, though. But for next projects, I know we had a list somewhere. Let's find it.
I'll just say what I'm doing. I'm doing a vid soon on Mark 1330, whenever that will be released.
Yeah. So
for those of you guys who don't know, Imago-Logos is a corporation. Well, not a corporation, but it's a corporate
group project.
group project of like many people who manage the YouTube channel. So that's why
Just a
they're able
group
to
of
post
nerds.
that content at a faster rate than me. So it's a real pleasure for you guys to come on here.
Yeah,
And
thank you for
hopefully we
having
can
us.
do this.
I appreciate it.
Hopefully we can do this
Yeah, that was
sometime.
fun.
Yeah, hopefully we can do this sometime again in the near future.
Yeah.
Or something related. Yeah. But until then, Achaboy signing out. Apollos.
Yeah, man.
Peace.
All right. See ya, guys.
All right.
See ya.